The trauma bay doors hadn't finished swinging open before she saw it. A man drenched in blood, barely breathing, strapped to a gurney moving fast, and across his chest, beneath the torn fabric of his shirt, a faded scar in the exact shape she'd only seen twice before in her life. Both times on a battlefield. Both times on men who'd survived things that should have killed them. Her stomach dropped, because she knew what that scar meant. She knew what was actually killing him. And she knew, with cold, absolute certainty, that the surgeon already walking toward that gurney was about to make the last mistake of this man's life. She had 40 seconds to stop it, maybe less. If this story already has you holding your breath, follow my channel and stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night had been quiet until it wasn't. Harlow County General Hospital sat on the western edge of Denton Falls, Wyoming, a mid-sized city that liked to think of itself as bigger than it was, the kind of place where the hospital board put the chief surgeon's photo on a banner outside the main entrance and considered that good community relations. The building was newer than it looked, a boxy concrete structure with automatic doors that stuck in cold weather and a trauma unit that handled, on a good month, maybe a dozen serious cases. Car wrecks, farm equipment, the occasional hunting accident. Tonight was not a good month. Nora Voss had been working the overnight trauma rotation for 11 hours by the time the radio crackled at 11:48 p.m. She was 36, lean in the way that came from never sitting down long enough to gain weight, with dark circles she'd stopped trying to conceal, and hands that didn't shake. Not anymore. She'd broken that habit somewhere around her second year in the Army, in a place she still didn't talk about in polite company. Now she was a nurse. Just a nurse, according to most people in this building. She'd let them think that. She was redressing a laceration on a 60-year-old rancher's forearm when the call came through. Male, mid-40s, found unconscious on Route 9 near the state border, suspected blunt force trauma, vitals tanking, ETA 4 minutes. Nora finished the bandage without rushing it, told the rancher to keep the arm elevated and not pick at the edges, and was already moving toward Trauma 1 before the second radio update came through. She pushed through the double doors ahead of the rest of the team. The gurney arrived in a controlled chaos of motion, paramedics calling out numbers, a respiratory tech jogging alongside, someone else shouting about a lost IV line. Nora stepped in close, got her hands on the patient's wrist, and looked at his face. Male, maybe 45, maybe older, big across the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual use rather than a gym. His shirt had been cut open by the paramedics and his chest was exposed, smeared with blood from a long gash along his left side. The wound was ugly, dramatic, the kind of injury that pulled every eye in the room toward it like a magnet. Nora's eyes went somewhere else. She looked at the scar. It ran diagonally across his sternum, old and pale, surgical in origin, but not from any civilian hospital procedure she recognized. The pattern of it, the angle, the length, the placement relative to the xiphoid process, matched a very specific kind of thoracic intervention, the kind performed under field conditions, rapidly. Without the benefit of an operating room, proper lighting, or time, her brain started running calculations she hadn't needed in years. Pulse, weak and thready, barely there at the radial artery. Skin, cold and clammy, not consistent with a surface wound that size. The blood pressure reading the paramedics handed off, 68/40, was catastrophically low, far too low to be explained by the chest laceration alone, which was bleeding, but not at a rate that justified these numbers. Something else was wrong, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the wound everyone in the room was staring at. She leaned over the patient's abdomen and pressed, gently, methodically, working from quadrant to quadrant, and felt it immediately. A rigidity that didn't belong there. A resistance that meant the abdominal cavity was filling with something it shouldn't contain. The bleeding wasn't in his chest, it was in his belly. Nora. One of the other nurses appeared at her elbow, Jessamine Kwok, 2 years out of school, quick-handed and sharp, but still learning to trust what she saw before she heard someone else say it first. Dr. Hale's on his way down. How long? 2 minutes, maybe 3. Nora looked at the monitor. BP had dropped another 4 points since she'd walked in. Her jaw tightened once, then relaxed. She started pulling supplies, not the chest tray that someone had already begun laying out on instinct, drawn by the obvious surface wound, but an abdominal ultrasound probe from the cart near the wall. She moved it into position, pressed the transducer against the patient's upper abdomen, and in 10 seconds she had a clear picture, fluid in the peritoneal cavity. A significant amount of it. Free fluid that had no business being there, the kind of finding that meant a vessel somewhere in this man's abdomen had given way and was losing ground fast. "Pull that chest tray back," she said. Jessamine hesitated. "Dr. Hale will want to—" "Pull it back, Jessamine." A beat of uncertainty. Then Jessamine moved the tray. The doors opened. Dr. Marcus Hale walked in the way he always did, deliberately unhurried, composed in a way that was partly genuine confidence and partly performance, because Marcus Hale had been told he was exceptional so consistently and for so long that he'd stopped examining the claim. 51 years old, silver at the temples, square-jawed and fit in the way of a man who exercised to maintain an image as much as his health. His name was on a plaque in the hospital lobby. His photograph was on the banner outside the main entrance. He was the department chief. He was also the kind of surgeon who entered a room expecting it to reorient around him. Usually, it did. He took one look at the patient's exposed chest wound and moved toward the chest tray, then stopped, noticed it wasn't where it should be, and looked around with a mild, controlled frown. "What's the status?" he said, not to anyone in particular, in the tone of a man asking for a recap of something he'd already decided. "Blunt force trauma, found unresponsive on Route 9, Jessamine started. "BP on arrival was 68/40. Currently, I see the BP." He'd picked up the chart and was scanning it. Chest wound with hemorrhagic presentation, possible rib involvement. We'll open and assess the... That's not where he's bleeding. Hale's hand stopped moving. He looked up slowly. Nora was standing on the other side of the gurney. She hadn't raised her voice. She wasn't performing anything. She'd said what she'd said because it was true and needed saying, and her expression communicated that she understood entirely how this was going to land, and had decided to say it anyway. "Excuse me," Hale said. "The chest wound is superficial. It looks worse than it is. The hemorrhage is abdominal. I've got fluid in the peritoneal cavity on ultrasound, visible right now on that screen." She nodded toward the monitor. "BP this low, with this presentation, and a chest wound that doesn't account for the volume loss. It's not his chest. If you open there, you're not going to find the source." Hale looked at the ultrasound image for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked back at her. "You're Voss," he said. "Night rotation." "Yes." "And you're telling me—" He said it slowly, carefully, with the particular patience of someone choosing their words to make a point, rather than to communicate. "Where the surgical priority lies. I'm telling you what the ultrasound shows and what his hemodynamics suggest. You can order a CT if you want confirmation, but his pressure is at 64 and falling, and we don't have time for—" "We don't have time," Hale repeated, and this time the patience had a sharper edge under it. "You're right about that." He looked at the chest tray. Looked at Jessamine. "Get the tray back in position." "Dr. Hale." Nora's voice stayed even. "His mesenteric vasculature." "Nurse Voss." He turned and looked at her directly, fully, in a way that was meant to end the conversation. "I've been performing trauma surgery for 22 years. I've managed hundreds of presentations with this exact hemorrhagic profile. I appreciate your concern. Step back." The room went quiet the way rooms do when someone with authority has spoken. And the question is whether anyone will push back. Nora looked at the monitor. BP, 61/38. She looked at the patient's face, the wax-pale skin, the lips losing color, the chest barely moving with each shallow, effortful breath. She looked at the scar on his sternum, that specific, impossible scar, and she thought about what kind of person had it and what it meant that he was here, in this room, on this table. Then she stepped back. It cost her something to do it. She felt the cost specifically, like a physical thing pressing against her sternum. But she'd been in enough rooms like this one to know that the moment you turn the intervention into a confrontation, the patient becomes secondary to the conflict. And this man didn't have the reserves for that. So she stepped back, and she watched. Hale made the incision at 11:59 p.m. The room moved with practiced efficiency around him. Techs responding to his hands, nurses adjusting angles, the choreography of a team that knew its lead and had learned not to improvise. He was fast, genuinely, undeniably fast. His hands moved with an economy that came from thousands of hours in operating rooms, and Nora watched them and acknowledged privately that the skill was real. The skill was just aimed at the wrong target. 40 seconds in, his rhythm changed. It was subtle, a slight hesitation, a fractional pause in the movement of his hands. The kind of thing only someone who was looking for it would catch. Nora caught it, because she was looking for exactly that. He was looking for the bleed, and he wasn't finding it, because it wasn't there. The monitor alarm changed pitch. BP, 53/30. He's crashing, someone said from the far side of the room. I'm aware. Hale's voice had shed its ease. He was working faster now, moving through the chest cavity with focused urgency, searching. And the searching itself was its own kind of answer, because a surgeon who'd found the source wouldn't be searching. Dr. Hale. Nora stepped closer. Not all the way in, just closer. His pressure is at 53. We are out of time. He didn't respond. His hands kept moving. She watched for 10 more seconds. 10 seconds during which the patient's systolic pressure dropped to 48, during which the color in his fingernails went from pale to gray, during which the monitor's tone shifted from urgent to something closer to conclusive. Then the alarm changed again. A different pattern, a different rhythm, and Jessamine's voice cut through the room. He's arresting. The half second that followed was the kind that Nora had experienced enough times to recognize. The moment when a room full of trained people all process the same information at the same instant, and the person in charge runs out of moves. Hale's hands stilled. She was already moving. She came around the gurney, positioned herself where Hale was, and said it quietly, close enough that it wasn't a broadcast, wasn't a spectacle. Get out of my way. Hale didn't move immediately. He looked at her face, at her hands, at whatever he saw in her expression that was different from what he'd seen 11 minutes ago, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not deference, not agreement. Something more like the involuntary response of a man who had spent 22 years being the authority in a room and had just encountered something that didn't recognize that authority as relevant. You cannot. He is dying. Move. He moved. She didn't think through what came next. She didn't narrate it to herself or plan it in steps. Her hands found positions that her nervous system had encoded years ago and never fully erased, and she worked, not with the smooth, controlled efficiency of an OR setting, but with the compressed, necessary speed of someone who had once performed interventions in the back of moving vehicles, in the dark, with inadequate equipment and no margin for error. She located the source in under a minute. The superior mesenteric artery. Partially sheared, seatbelt trauma at high velocity, she assessed, consistent with a high-speed impact on Route 9, and leaking steadily, progressively, into the peritoneal cavity with no place for the blood to go. She got a clamp on it, held pressure with her left hand while her right reached without looking for the suture kit, and someone put it in her palm without being asked. Jessamine. It had to be Jessamine. She worked. The room was quiet except for the monitor and the sound of her moving, and somewhere behind her, the controlled breathing of a department chief who was standing against the wall with nothing to do. BP, 58/33, then 64/37. Climbing. Slowly. Not gracefully. Not in the smooth, reassuring arc of a patient recovering in a controlled environment, but in the labored, incremental way of a body that had been very close to the edge and was pulling back from it by degrees, one measure at a time. Keep climbing, Nora said, not to anyone in particular. It kept climbing. At 12:31 a.m., the patient was stable enough to move. Not stable by any comfortable standard, he was going to need the OR, was going to need a proper surgical team to close what she'd held together, was going to need blood and time and luck, but stable in the sense that he was still a person with a pulse and a pressure and a measurable future. She walked alongside the gurney to the OR doors and stopped there. She stood in the hallway after the doors swung shut and let out a breath that she'd been holding, not continuously, but in pieces, since the moment the gurney had come through trauma. Jessamine came up beside her and didn't say anything, which was the right call. After a moment, Nora went to the scrub sink at the end of the hall and washed her hands. In the mirror above the sink, she looked at herself without particular sentiment. The circles under her eyes, the jaw set slightly too tight. The particular flatness of expression that she knew from experience appeared on her face in the aftermath of high-stakes situations and took a few hours to relax. She'd been at Harlow County for 8 months. 8 months of overnight rotations and straightforward cases and a staff hierarchy she'd learned to navigate by staying quiet and doing her work and not giving anyone a reason to look at her too closely. Before this, 14 months at a regional hospital in Billings. Before that, 3 years at a VA outpatient clinic in Colorado Springs. Before that, a period of her life that ran 6 years and covered multiple countries and required clearances she'd never mention in a job interview, and experiences she'd spent considerable energy learning to carry without letting them carry her instead. None of that was on her nursing resume. She dried her hands and went back to the unit. At 3:10 a.m., Derek Pruitt found her in the break room. Hospital administrator. The kind of man whose entire professional identity was built around never being in the room when the difficult things happened, only arriving afterward to manage the paperwork they generated. He sat down across from her with a folder and an expression he'd practiced into something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite neutrality, but lived uncomfortably between them. He placed the folder on the table. "Dr. Hale has filed a formal incident report," he said. Nora looked at the folder. "I expected that. He's alleging unauthorized physical displacement from an active procedure, performance of a surgical intervention without credentials or authorization, and reckless endangerment of a trauma patient." Pruitt said all of it with the careful diction of a man reading from a script he wished he hadn't been handed. "He's requesting immediate review of your employment. The patient is alive." "I know." His pressure was at 48 when I intervened. He was arresting. The chest wound Hale opened showed no active hemorrhage because the source was abdominal, which I identified on ultrasound at 11:52 and documented in the system with a timestamp. "Nora." Pruitt's voice dropped a register. "I believe you. I want you to understand that I'm not sitting here because I think you did something wrong. I'm sitting here because Dr. Hale is the department chief, and he has filed a formal complaint, and hospital policy does not give me discretion about what happens next." "Suspension pending review." "Yes." She looked at what was left of her granola bar on the table, put it down, pushed back her chair. "Tonight or morning?" Pruitt looked genuinely uncomfortable. "If you could remain until the end of your shift, I'll leave my badge at the nurse's station now." She picked up her water bottle. "Tell whoever picks up the Route 9 patient to review the OR telemetry from tonight's procedure, not just the chart entries. The monitor data doesn't lie and it doesn't get edited." She said it levelly, without heat, the way she'd have said anything factual and important that needed to be passed along. Then she walked out of the break room without waiting for a response. At the nurse's station, she unclipped her badge, Harlow County General /Nora Voss /RN, and set it on the counter. Jessamine was behind the desk, very carefully reading something she wasn't reading. "Hey," Nora said. Jessamine looked up. Her eyes were too careful, the kind of carefully neutral expression that meant she was feeling something she'd decided not to show. "Check on him in the morning," Nora said. "The Route 9 patient. Make sure his case gets a second set of eyes." "I will." A pause. "Nora, get some sleep when your rotation ends." She picked up her jacket. "You did good tonight." She walked out through the automatic doors, which stuck slightly in the cold, as they always did, and crossed the staff parking lot under a sky that was fully dark and completely clear, the kind of Wyoming sky that had too many stars and didn't care what was happening beneath them. She sat in her car without starting it. She thought about the scar, not about Hale or Pruitt or the suspension or what the review board would or wouldn't find. All of that was a process, and processes moved at their own speed, and there was nothing she could do about any of it before morning. She thought about the scar on the patient's chest, the specific angle, the exact placement, the signature of a procedure that was performed in a very particular set of circumstances by a very particular kind of trained hand. And she thought about what it meant that this man had ended up on Route 9 in the middle of nowhere, bleeding out with no identification and no one who'd called it in except a passing trucker who'd seen something that looked wrong in the dark. She thought about the tattoo she'd noticed on his left forearm when she'd had her hands in his abdomen. She'd only glimpsed it, half hidden by the surgical drape, partially obscured, but she'd seen enough. A specific insignia. One she recognized. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. She started the car. drove home through the empty streets of Denton Falls, parked in front of her building, went inside, and sat at her kitchen table in the dark without turning on a light. She didn't sleep. She knew she wouldn't. She'd been in enough situations that ended with a quiet room and too much to think about to pretend otherwise. She sat there and thought about the man in recovery, about the scar and the tattoo, and the question of who he was and how he'd ended up on that particular stretch of road in that particular condition. And she thought about the fact that Marcus Hale was right now, almost certainly, sitting at his desk writing a version of tonight's events that would be thorough and detailed and entirely arranged to serve his interests. And she thought about the timestamp on the ultrasound image. 11:52 p.m. Objective. Unedited. Sitting in the hospital's imaging system whether anyone wanted it there or not. That was something. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the block and then went quiet. The city slept. Nora Voss sat in the dark kitchen of her apartment and waited for morning, and thought about a scar she'd seen twice before. Never in a civilian hospital, never on a patient with a clean history, and tried to convince herself that whatever came next was going to follow the ordinary logic of an employment dispute and a hospital review board. She almost managed it. Then she thought about the tattoo again, and the particular insignia on it, and she stopped trying. Whatever was lying in recovery down the hall at Harlow County General was not going to stay quiet. And the moment he woke up, if he woke up, and she had made certain he would, nothing about the next few days was going to be ordinary at all. She just didn't know yet how fast the ground was going to shift. The morning came gray and flat, the way Wyoming mornings did in late October when the season had made up its mind and wasn't interested in negotiating. Nora had been awake since 4. She'd made coffee she didn't finish, stared at her phone twice without calling anyone, and changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a worn flannel that had belonged to someone else a long time ago. She sat at the kitchen table until the light outside shifted from black to the particular colorless gray of early morning, and then she got up, poured the cold coffee down the drain, and made fresh. She was on her second cup when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Jessamine. "Yeah," she answered. "He's awake." Jessamine's voice was low, careful. She was probably at the nurse's station, probably with people nearby. "Route 9. He came around about 40 minutes ago. He's..." A pause. "He's asking for you." Nora set down her mug. "He doesn't know my name." "He described you, exactly. Height, hair, the way you talk." Another pause, shorter. "Nora, he knew your last name. He said it." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "I'm suspended," Nora said. "I know. Pruitt will lose his mind if I show up." "I know that too," Jessamine breathed out slowly. "I'm just telling you what he said. He was pretty insistent. He's not doing great physically. Stable but not comfortable. He won't let the day team do a full assessment. He keeps..." She stopped. "Keeps what?" "Asking if you're the one who operated." Nora looked at the window. The sky outside was getting lighter, barely, the darkness thinning into something closer to gray without committing to actual dawn. "Don't tell him anything," she said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." She didn't spend much time debating whether to go. The calculation, employment status, hospital policy, what Pruitt would say, lasted maybe 4 seconds before something more fundamental overrode it. She had been the last person responsible for this man's continued existence on the planet. That wasn't a clinical abstraction. It had actual weight, and the weight didn't evaporate because someone had taken her badge and told her to go home. She drove to Harlow County with the heat on and the radio off. The staff lot had a rear entrance she'd used for 8 months without anyone questioning it. She went in through it now, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and came out on the 3rd-floor corridor, which was quieter at 6 in the morning than any other part of the building. The day shift was arriving but hadn't fully organized yet. The outgoing night staff were deep in handoff mode, faces angled at charts and handover notes, minds occupied with the transition and not particularly alert to a woman in civilian clothes moving through the hallway with a purposeful stride. She found his room at the end of the corridor, door slightly ajar. She pushed it open. He was larger than she'd fully registered in the trauma bay, consciously, wakefully large. The kind of man who occupied space in a way that wasn't aggressive but was simply physical fact, like the room had made a quiet accommodation for him rather than the other way around. He was propped at a 30-degree angle, which was about as far as the abdominal drainage lines would reasonably allow, and his skin was the color of someone who had spent several hours in an even trade of blood for IV fluid and hadn't fully come out ahead yet. But his eyes were open, and they found her the moment the door moved. Dark eyes, very steady, carrying the particular quality of eyes that have learned not to broadcast their interior. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she stood in the doorway and looked back, and the silence between them had a specific texture to it, not awkward, not empty, but the kind of silence that exists between two people who both understand that speaking carelessly in certain situations carries consequences. "You're Voss," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation, low and deliberate. "I am." "You fixed the artery." "I clamped it. A surgical team closed it properly." He absorbed this without changing his expression, his eyes moving over her in the rapid, systematic way of someone conducting an assessment rather than an appraisal. "Taking inventory. You're not in scrubs." "No." "They suspended you." Not a question. She came the rest of the way into the room and let the door fall shut behind her. "You should be sleeping." "I'll sleep later." He shifted slightly against the incline of the bed, and the monitors registered the movement, a small spike in heart rate before settling back. His jaw tightened once with the effort it cost him, then relaxed with the controlled deliberateness of someone who had significant practice managing pain without advertising it. "I need to know what's in my chart." "I haven't had access to your chart since Tuesday night." "What was in it Tuesday night?" She moved the visitor chair a foot closer to the bed. Not intimate, just close enough to keep the conversation below the level that would carry through the door, and sat down. "Your presenting injury was documented as a chest laceration with hemorrhagic complication. The abdominal intervention was," she chose the word with care, "attributed to the surgical team in the operative notes." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise. The absence of surprise, which was its own kind of information. "Not to you." "No." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "The surgeon." "Hale." She said nothing. "He filed against you." "You've been conscious for 40 minutes, she said. "I heard the nurses talking. I wasn't as far under as they thought." A pause. "How bad is your situation?" "That's not your problem right now." "I'm making it my problem." He said it without heat, without the performance of concern, just flatly, as a man states a position he's already committed to. "You saved my life. That earns it." Nora looked at him directly. "What's your name?" A beat of consideration. "Garrett," he said. "Garrett Wills." She held his gaze and waited. He looked back at her with those level, unrevealing eyes, and between them was the particular tension of two people who both suspected the other was carrying more than they were saying out loud. "That's a real name," she said. "Is it your current one?" His mouth moved towards something that almost became a smile without completing the journey. "For most purposes." "Mr. Wills," she leaned forward slightly. "The scar on your chest, the old one, not from Tuesday. I've seen that procedure twice in my life. Once in Kandahar, once at a forward operating base in a country I don't say by name in civilian buildings." She kept her voice even, factual. "So I'm going to ask you once, and I'd appreciate a straight answer. Who's going to come looking for you?" The almost smile faded entirely. The monitor beeped in the silence between them. "People who aren't going to be happy about the chart entries," he said. "I assumed. How many, and how soon?" "Can't give you a number." He shifted again, controlled the response his body wanted to make to that movement. "Soon, though. Already moving, probably." She believed him. Not from any naive inclination to trust a man she'd met while her hands were in his abdominal cavity, but because the way he said it had the specific texture of truth that is underspecified, not because the speaker knows less than they claim, but because they know more than they're permitted to share. It was the precision of a man giving her the accurate outline while keeping the classified interior to himself. "You need to rest," she said. "Whatever is coming, you'll meet it better if your body isn't running at a deficit. You lost significant volume Tuesday night. The drainage lines need time to do their job." He considered this with the air of someone weighing it genuinely, rather than just waiting for her to finish. "You're not going to ask what I do." "I already know what you do," she said. "I just don't know which branch." This time the almost smile made it all the way. Brief, tired, and carrying something in it that was close to recognition. the look of someone encountering a person who speaks the same unspoken language. Navy, he said. She nodded once, stood. I'll check on you when I can, she said. Don't make life difficult for the day team. Let them work. Voss, he said her name the way people say names when they need you to stop moving. She stopped. Thank you. She looked at him for a moment. Eat what they bring you and don't pull the drainage lines. She left before he could respond. In the hallway, she moved fast toward the stairwell and walked directly into Derek Pruitt, who was stepping off the elevator with a coffee cup and the expression of a man whose morning had just acquired a complication he hadn't budgeted for. They looked at each other. Nora, he said. Derek, you're suspended. I know. He glanced past her toward the room she'd come from, back to her face. He asked for you specifically? He did? Pruitt rubbed his free hand over his face. He was fundamentally a decent man, Nora had always thought. Decent in the way that made his job genuinely hard, because his job occasionally required him to do indecent things for institutional reasons, and he didn't have enough cynicism to make that comfortable. I can't have you in the building. If Hale finds out you were here, Hale won't be in until 9. I'll be gone in 90 seconds. She kept walking. The patient in 312, Wills, his chart needs review by someone other than Hale or Hale's team. I'd put that in writing if I were you. That's not really... Nora, I can't just unilaterally... In writing, Derek, time-stamped. She pushed through the stairwell door. Do it for yourself. She drove home in this gray morning and sat in her apartment and turned what Wills had said over in her mind. People who aren't going to be happy about the chart entries. Not people who will visit. Not people who will call. People who will have a specific reaction to a specific problem, which was the language of someone who knew precisely who was coming and had a clear picture of what they'd be looking for when they arrived. She opened her laptop. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. She searched the stretch of Route 9 where Wills had been found and got nothing useful, a 2-lane state highway that existed mainly to connect smaller places to other smaller places, minimal overnight traffic, no accident report in the local news, no accessible police record for an active case. A trucker had called it in, which put the initial response with the county sheriff, and those records weren't public. She tried Garrett Wills. Navy. Got 11 results that weren't him, which she'd expected. People with his particular combination of scar, eyes, and calibrated understatement didn't maintain searchable public profiles. She closed the laptop and thought about the review board. Per standard Harlow County policy, the formal employment review had to occur within 72 hours of suspension. That put it at Thursday morning. She'd be sitting across from a panel of administrators and, in all likelihood, a physician representative, which at this hospital, given the departmental structure, meant someone who existed in the same professional ecosystem as Marcus Hale and had career reasons to prefer outcomes that didn't embarrass the department. The ultrasound timestamp was her strongest card. Objective imaging, unedited, timestamped at 11:52 p.m., showing free abdominal fluid clearly enough that any competent clinician could read it, 6 minutes before Hale made his incision in the wrong location. Irrefutable, as long as it stayed in the system intact. She picked up her phone and called Jessamine. The imaging from Tuesday night, she said when Jessamine answered. Is it still in the patient's file? I checked this morning. It's there. Can you screenshot it, timestamp visible, patient ID visible, and send it to your personal email? Not your work account. A pause. She could hear Jessamine's breathing, the small sounds of the nurse's station behind her. Nora, that's... I know what it is. If you're not comfortable, don't. I mean that. A longer pause. I did it at 4 this morning, Jessamine said quietly, before you called. Nora let out a slow breath. Okay. I also saved the monitor telemetry report, the one the system generates automatically. It logs every alarm, every pressure reading, every rhythm change with a timestamp. I emailed it to myself and printed a copy. You printed it. It's in my locker. Nora was quiet for a moment. You're going to be a very good nurse, Jessamine. I learned from someone who apparently has a medical degree and never mentioned it. Nora didn't respond to that. She said goodbye and hung up. The next 2 days moved with the particular grinding slowness of days spent waiting for an institutional process to reach you. Nora ran in the mornings because she needed to do something with her body, or it started working against her. 6 miles on the first day, 8 on the second, through neighborhoods that were emptying out as October deepened and the cold became less negotiable. She ate regular meals because she'd learned over years that included some genuinely difficult stretches that the body was either an ally or a liability, depending almost entirely on whether you maintained it, like it mattered. She slept badly and accepted this without fighting it. On Wednesday afternoon, Jessamine texted, "He's been asking about you again." Also, 2 men came to his room this morning. Suits, not hospital staff, not law enforcement I recognized. Stayed about 40 minutes. One of them made a phone call in the hallway outside his room. Couldn't hear the call, but his body language was serious. Nora read this standing at her kitchen counter and wrote back, "How is he physically?" The reply came fast. "Better than he has any right to be. Drainage output dropping. He ate actual food today. Still blocking Hale's team from doing a full assessment whenever he can get away with it." She set the phone down and stood at the window looking at the street below. 2 men in suits spending 40 minutes with a Navy man in a civilian hospital in Denton Falls, Wyoming, and then making a serious phone call in the hallway. She thought about what Wills had said. Already moving, probably. She thought about what that meant in practical terms, about the kind of machinery that started moving when a man with that particular scar and that particular tattoo ended up on a table in a rural Wyoming hospital with falsified chart entries and a suspended nurse and a department chief who'd filed a complaint to protect himself. She thought about what that machinery looked like when it arrived. Thursday morning, 9 a.m. The review was in the second-floor conference room, a beige rectangle with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look marginally unwell. Nora arrived at 8:55 in dark slacks and a gray button-down. She'd slept 4 hours and felt them, but she'd been functional on 4 hours before in circumstances considerably more demanding than this, and she knew the difference between tired and impaired. The panel was 3 people: Derek Pruitt for administration, Dr. Linda Ashworth, chief of medicine, 60 years old, 30 of them in this building, the kind of physician administrator who made decisions by identifying the path of least institutional disruption and following it with consistent reliability. And Patricia Vance, the hospital's legal counsel, who had the careful, neutral expression of someone paid to anticipate damage and minimize it. Marcus Hale was not on the panel. He was present anyway, seated against the left wall, outside the formal structure, in the established position of the complainant. He was in a suit. He had a folder organized in front of him with the neatness of a man who had spent time on this. He looked like someone who had decided in advance how this meeting ended. Pruitt opened the proceedings with administrative language: date, case number, nature of complaint, rights of all parties, scope of review. Nora sat straight, hands flat on the table, and listened without interrupting. Then Hale presented his case. He was good at it. She'd anticipated that he would be. 22 years of department politics, of managing a professional reputation in an environment where reputation was partly built on clinical results and partly on social capital, had given him a real fluency in this kind of room. He walked through Tuesday night with a confident, detailed narrative that was accurate in its individual facts and completely wrong in its architecture. He had responded to a trauma patient. He had assessed the injury and identified the appropriate intervention. At this juncture, his voice modulated into the register of a man reporting something that genuinely troubled him. Nurse Voss had become agitated, had challenged his clinical judgment without clinical basis, had physically displaced him from an active procedure, and had performed an unauthorized intervention that placed the patient at serious risk. He used the phrase unauthorized intervention 4 times. He used the word agitated 3 times. He was building a portrait, and he was building it deliberately. He had documentation, chart entries printed and organized into a clear, coherent narrative. The timeline he presented positioned his own decision-making as primary and correct, with Nora's actions as the complicating factor rather than the corrective one. It was thorough. It was organized. It bore a structural resemblance to what had actually happened in the same way that a deliberately constructed false account resembles the truth, sharing enough elements to feel plausible, differing in every place that mattered. Ashworth was taking notes. Vance's expression stayed neutral. Pruitt looked at the table. When Hale finished, Pruitt turned to her. "Ms. Voss, your response." She'd spent 2 days deciding how to do this. She'd discarded the versions that were too defensive, too focused on dismantling Hale's narrative point by point, too personal. She'd settled on something simpler. The abdominal ultrasound from Tuesday night at 11:52 p.m. is in the patient's imaging file, she said. I'd like it pulled up, if possible. Pruitt had a laptop. He navigated to the imaging system, located the file, and turned the screen so the panel could see it. That image shows free fluid in the peritoneal cavity, Nora said. Consistent with internal abdominal hemorrhage. It was documented at 11:52 p.m., 6 minutes before Dr. Hale made his incision. It was documented by me and Trauma 1 using the room's ultrasound equipment, and it is time-stamped in the hospital imaging system. She looked at the panel without looking at Hale. I reported this finding to Dr. Hale verbally before he proceeded. He proceeded anyway, with a thoracic approach. The patient's blood pressure at the time of incision was 64/38. By the time I intervened, it was 48/29 and the patient was in cardiac arrest. But nobody spoke. The room's monitoring data is also archived, she continued. Every blood pressure reading, every rhythm strip, every alarm trigger from that room on Tuesday night is time-stamped and stored automatically in the system. I'm requesting that it be reviewed alongside Dr. Hale's chart entries. The two records will not say the same things. Ashworth had stopped writing. Hale's expression had remained controlled until this point. Now something was working at the edges of it, not visible yet, but present in the way a hairline fracture is present in material that hasn't broken yet. The fluid presentation on that imaging was ambiguous, he said. My clinical read at the time, Dr. Ashworth. Nora looked directly at the chief of medicine. You've been reading abdominal imaging for 30 years. Is that presentation ambiguous? It was a risk. She knew it walking in. Addressing a panel member directly was outside the usual choreography of proceedings like this, and it could read as aggressive rather than confident. She took the risk anyway because the alternative was allowing Hale to establish a foothold in ambiguity that didn't exist. Ashworth looked at the screen. She looked at it for several seconds, with the unhurried attention of someone who was genuinely assessing rather than performing assessment. No, she said, it isn't. The room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically. The fluorescent lights kept humming, and the heating system kept running, and Patricia Vance's pen was still in her hand. But the weight distribution in the room changed in a way that was palpable to anyone paying attention, and everyone in that room was paying attention. Hale's folder was still open in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it. There remained questions, Vance said carefully, in the tone of someone trying to identify ground that was still stable, regarding the scope of the intervention Ms. Voss performed, the credentials that would be required to— I have a medical degree, Nora said. The sentence landed in the room and sat there. I'm sorry? Vance said. Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, class of 2013, board certification in emergency medicine, 2015. Secondary certification in trauma surgery, 2016. I practiced as a physician for 6 years before I transitioned out of clinical medicine and completed an accelerated nursing program. Pashipan. She said all of it in the same register she'd have used to read off a supply list, factual, precise, without drama. My medical credentials are on active status with the Wyoming Board of Medicine. I renewed in March. The documentation is available immediately if the board needs verification. The conference room was completely silent. She had not planned to say it here. She had planned to let the imaging and the telemetry carry the argument, because they should have been sufficient, because the evidence should not have required her to unveil anything about who she was before this hospital, because the facts of Tuesday night were clear enough on their own. But Vance's framing had been designed to position her intervention as amateur interference, as a nurse overreaching into surgical territory, and she had made a decision between one breath and the next that she was done allowing a false frame to stand when the truth was available. Hale was staring at her. You're a physician, Ashworth said. Not quite a question. I was. I'm currently a nurse by choice. The longer explanation isn't relevant to Tuesday night. She looked at Pruitt. Hopkins can send verification within the hour. Pruitt had the look of a man who needed a moment he wasn't going to get. Hale stood up. The movement was sharp enough that Pruitt flinched slightly. She never disclosed this. No one in this building had any— I wasn't asked, Nora said. My nursing license is valid and current. I was hired as a nurse and I have worked as a nurse. My prior credentials were not relevant to my employment until Dr. Vance raised the question of whether I was qualified to recognize internal hemorrhage and intervene in an emergency. She looked at Hale directly, for the first time since sitting down. I was qualified. The patient survived. The imaging time stamped 6 minutes before your incision confirms that I identified the correct diagnosis before you proceeded with the incorrect one. Hale's jaw set hard. I want a recess, he said. I need time to… This changes the entire basis of… I don't think a recess is necessary. Ashworth's voice had changed register, still measured, still carrying institutional weight, but aimed in a different direction than it had been 20 minutes ago. I think we have sufficient information to continue. Hale looked at her, then at Vance, then at Pruitt, who was studying the surface of the conference table with the focused attention of a man who had decided the safest thing he could do was remove himself from everyone's line of sight. Marcus, Ashworth's voice went quieter. Sit down. He didn't sit down. He stood there holding his folder at his side with the look of a man who had entered this room as the clear protagonist of a story and was in the process of absorbing the information that the story had changed shape on him somewhere in the last quarter hour. He had come in with a complete, organized narrative, and it had been insufficient, not because Nora had argued better, but because she had simply told the truth about things that existed in the hospital's own systems and couldn't be edited. Then his phone buzzed. He pulled it out with the automatic motion of a man who checks his phone without thinking and looked at the screen. And whatever the screen showed did something to his face that Nora watched carefully. Not guilt, not straightforward fear. Something more complicated. A recognition that compressed his expression inward for just a moment before the practiced professional composure came back down over it, like a shutter closing. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. I need to step out, he said. Marcus, we're in the middle of… I need to step out. He said it with a flatness that was different from his earlier controlled authority. Less performance, more actual need. He walked to the door without waiting for a response from anyone and went through it, and the door clicked shut behind him. The 4 remaining people sat in the particular silence of a room from which a significant presence has just abruptly departed. Patricia Vance set her pen down, picked it up again. Well, she said, with the careful tone of someone selecting a word that commits to nothing. I think we should discuss next steps. Nora kept her eyes on the door. She didn't know what had been on that screen. She didn't know who had sent it, or what it had said, or why it had landed with that specific gravity at this specific moment. But she'd spent enough years in rooms where information arrived and changed the shape of everything to recognize what it looked like when someone received news that recontextualized everything they thought they were managing. Whatever Hale had just read, it had not reassured him. She looked back at the panel and kept her expression level, and said nothing further, and waited. 2 floors up, in room 312, Garrett Wills was sitting upright in his hospital bed holding a phone he hadn't had 3 hours ago. The phone had arrived in a manner he wasn't going to document, delivered by someone he recognized, and on its screen was a message from a number he knew well. It said, "Package delivered, command aware, assets inbound, brace." He read it twice. Then he deleted it, old habit, deeper than thought, and set the phone face down on the blanket beside him and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time since waking up in this room, something loosen in his chest that wasn't related to the drainage lines. They were moving, which meant it was almost over, which also meant it was about to get considerably louder before the quiet came back. Down the hall, Marcus Hale was standing in the corridor outside the conference room with his phone in his hand and a very specific problem. The call he'd just gotten was from the hospital's legal department, not Vance, a different attorney, one who handled regulatory matters. And what she'd said in 45 seconds had taken everything he'd built over 22 years and shown him exactly how fragile the foundation was. Federal investigators, she'd said. DOD inquiry. Medical record subpoena. Already filed. He put the phone back in his pocket. He stood in the corridor for a moment with the fluorescent lights humming above him and the sound of the hospital going about its morning all around him, and thought about all the decisions that had led him to this particular hallway on this particular Thursday morning. He thought about the chart entries he'd made at 1:15 a.m. on Wednesday, about the specific language he'd chosen, about the things he'd added and the things he'd removed. He thought about a nurse who had turned out to be something else entirely, who had a medical degree from Johns Hopkins and certifications he hadn't known about, and a timestamp on an ultrasound image that predated his incision by 6 minutes and could not be explained away by any version of events he was capable of constructing. The door to the conference room was 20 feet behind him. He didn't go back through it. He didn't go back through the conference room door. Nora watched the empty hallway through the narrow window panel in the door for a moment, then turned back to the panel. Pruitt was looking at his laptop screen without appearing to see it. Ashworth had set down her pen and was sitting with her hands folded on the table in the posture of someone who had recalibrated and was waiting for the room to catch up. Vance was writing something in the margin of her legal pad, small, tight script that probably said nothing useful. "I'd like to formally request," Nora said, "that the monitor telemetry from Trauma 1 on Tuesday night be pulled into this record before any determination is made." Ashworth looked at Pruitt. Pruitt nodded at his laptop without much resistance. Whatever momentum Hale had brought into this room had walked out with him, and the 3 people remaining seemed to be in quiet, unspoken agreement that the landscape had changed. "We'll recess for 30 minutes, Ashworth said. "Derek, get the telemetry. Patricia, I'd like a word." Nora stood, pushed in her chair, and walked out into the hallway. Hale was not there. The corridor was ordinary, a housekeeping cart parked outside a supply room, the sound of the elevator arriving and opening and closing again, a dietary aide moving a tray cart toward the stairwell. Whatever Hale had needed to do after reading that message on his phone, he'd gone somewhere else to do it. She walked to the end of the hall and stood at the window that looked out over the hospital's east parking lot. The sky had cleared overnight, and the morning was bright and flat and very cold, the kind of October cold in Wyoming that had stopped being polite about what was coming. A few cars in the lot, an ambulance parked with its back doors open, no one attending it. A black SUV she didn't recognize near the far entrance, tinted windows, government plates. She looked at the plates for a moment. Then she took out her phone and called Jessamine. "Is Will still in 312?" she said. "As of 20 minutes ago, yes." "Why?" "Black SUV in the east lot. Government plates. Have you seen anyone new on the floor this morning?" A pause. She could hear Jessamine moving, the squeak of shoes on the floor, the distant sound of monitors. "There are 2 men in the 3rd floor corridor who weren't there at handoff. They're not wearing badges. I assumed administration." "They're not administration. Don't engage them. Don't tell them anything about the patient, and don't let them into his room without his explicit consent. His, not anyone else's." "Nora, I can't exactly stop federal." "You can require them to produce identification and wait for the patient's verbal confirmation. That's standard patient rights protocol, and it's entirely within your authority." She paused. "If anyone tries to access his medical record without his consent or a court order, you document who asked and when. Okay?" Jessamine's voice had gone careful and focused. "Okay." Nora hung up and looked at the SUV in the lot. She'd been expecting something. Wills had told her to expect something. But there was a difference between abstractly anticipating the arrival of federal attention and standing at a 2nd-floor window watching it park. Her chest had that particular tightness she recognized, not fear, not anxiety, but the physical response to a situation that had just graduated from manageable complexity to something with harder edges and faster consequences. She went back to the conference room at the 30-minute mark. Ashworth and Pruitt were at the table. Vance was on her phone in the corner, speaking quietly. The laptop was open and the monitor telemetry was on the screen, a long printout of time-stamped data, BP readings, and rhythm tracings and alarm records running across several pages. Hale was not in the room. Nora sat down. "Nora." Ashworth looked at the telemetry for a long moment. Not the look of a physician performing review, but the look of one who had read it and was now sitting with what it said. "This data," she said, "is going to require a formal response from Dr. Hale." "Yes," Nora said. "His chart entries from Wednesday morning, specifically the 1:15 a.m. operative summary, are inconsistent with this record in several significant points." "Yes," Nora said again. She didn't elaborate. Ashworth was a competent physician, and she could read a telemetry record, and she didn't need Nora to narrate what was in front of her. Vance came back to the table and sat down. Her expression had shifted, not dramatically, but the carefully neutral quality had given way to something more specifically cautious, like a person who has just received information that changed the stakes of the meeting they're in. "I've just been informed," she said, that Harlow County General has received a records subpoena from the Department of Defense's Inspector General Office. It covers all medical documentation related to the patient in room 312, including chart entries, imaging, operative records, and nursing notes for the period Tuesday night through the present. The room was quiet. When? Pruitt said. Filed yesterday. We received formal notice in the last hour. Vance looked at her legal pad. The scope of the subpoena suggests this patient is a federal matter, which means this review— She stopped, chose her next words carefully. This review may be occurring in a context that is significantly larger than a standard employment dispute. Nora kept her face neutral. She'd known this was coming in the abstract. Hearing it stated out loud by the hospital's legal counsel in a beige conference room in Denton Falls, Wyoming, was a different experience from knowing it abstractly, and she took a moment to let it settle before she responded to anything. Does the subpoena cover the imaging timestamp? She said. It covers all documentation, Vance said. Then the investigation has access to objective evidence of the sequence of events on Tuesday night, which means this panel has access to the same evidence. She looked at Ashworth. I think the review can proceed on its merits. Ashworth looked at her for a moment in a way that was hard to read. Not hostile, not exactly warm, but containing something that might have been a kind of reluctant reassessment. We'll need to notify Dr. Hale that the hearing is continuing, she said. Pruitt tried Hale's extension. No answer. Tried his cell. No answer. They waited 12 minutes. Hale didn't return. We'll proceed, Ashworth said. What followed was 40 minutes of methodical, unglamorous work, cross-referencing the telemetry timestamps against the chart entries, documenting every inconsistency, building a factual record that would exist whether Marcus Hale participated in its construction or not. Nora answered questions when she was asked them and didn't volunteer more than was requested. She was conscious of the fact that she was sitting in a room where the legal landscape had just shifted, and that the careful, boring work of establishing a documented factual record was more valuable right now than any argument she could make. Pruitt found Hale at 10:47 a.m. He sent a text to the conference room, a single line to Ashworth's phone that she read, showed to Vance, and did not show to Nora. But Nora could read a room, and what the two women's expressions did in the 2 seconds after reading it told her enough. Whatever Pruitt had found, it was not that Hale had stepped out for coffee. We'll need to adjourn for today, Ashworth said. The review is incomplete, Nora said. I'm aware. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. Your suspension is extended another 24 hours pending that session. Ashworth looked at her directly. Ms. Voss, I want to be clear. The extension is procedural. It is not an indication of the panel's current thinking. That was as much as she was going to say in this room with a lawyer present, and Nora understood that. She nodded, collected her folder, and stood. She was in the stairwell when her phone buzzed. Jessamine. She answered before the second vibration. He's gone, Jessamine said. Not panicked. Jessamine didn't panic, but tight and fast and focused. Wills, he's not in 312. Nora stopped on the landing. What do you mean he's not? His bed is empty. The drainage lines are on the floor. He removed them himself, which Jessamine's voice caught for a fraction of a second. Nora, he pulled his own drainage lines. There's blood on the floor tiles. Not a lot, but when? Sometime in the last hour. The last visual check was at 9:40. He was there at 9:40. The two men in the corridor, are they still there? They left at 10:15, all three of them. A pause. I think he went with them. Nora was already moving down the stairs. Voluntarily? Yes, I think so. There was no alarm, no call, nothing from his room. He just left. She pushed through the stairwell door at the ground level and moved toward the east exit. Is the black SUV still in the lot? A pause. She could hear Jessamine moving to a window. No, it's gone. Nora pushed through the east door into the cold and stood in the parking lot and looked at the empty space where the SUV had been. The asphalt was dry. No glass, no disturbance. Nothing to indicate anything other than a vehicle that had arrived and then left with its occupants. She stood there in the cold for a moment. A man with 2 removed abdominal drainage lines and a surgical wound less than 48 hours old had gotten into a government vehicle and gone somewhere. That was a medical problem. Removed drainage lines this early meant risk of fluid accumulation, risk of infection, risk of the wound environment becoming hostile in ways that would require intervention. He needed monitoring. He needed clean dressing changes and antibiotic coverage and someone checking his abdominal sounds every 4 hours. He knew all of that. He'd chosen to leave anyway, which meant wherever he was going, he'd judged it more important than his own recovery, or someone had judged it for him. She went back inside. She spent the rest of Thursday doing things that were concrete and within her control. She called Hopkins and requested expedited verification of her credentials, which would arrive by morning. She wrote a detailed timeline of Tuesday night's events in her own hand, specific and chronological, and emailed it to herself with a timestamp. She called the Wyoming State Board of Nursing and confirmed that no action had been initiated against her license. It hadn't, which meant Hale hadn't gone that route yet, or hadn't gotten there yet. Then she sat at her kitchen table and tried not to think about Garrett Wills pulling his own drainage lines in a hospital room and bleeding onto the floor tiles and walking out anyway, and mostly failed. She was almost asleep at 11 p.m. when her phone rang. Unknown number, Wyoming area code, but one she didn't recognize. She answered. "Dr. Voss?" A man's voice. Older, measured, with the particular economy of someone who had spent a career communicating in situations where precision mattered. "My name is Rear Admiral Thomas Carrick. I apologize for the hour. I need about 10 minutes of your time." She sat up. "I'm not a doctor," she said. "Technically. You hold an active medical license in the state of Wyoming and board certifications in emergency medicine and trauma surgery," Carrick said. "I'll call you whatever you prefer. Do you have 10 minutes? "Yes." Garrett Wills is in a secure medical facility approximately 90 miles from Denton Falls. He's being monitored. The drainage lines were... A brief pause. An improvised solution was applied. He's not comfortable, but he's not in immediate danger. Define not in immediate danger. His vitals are stable, he has IV access and antibiotic coverage, and someone with paramedic training checking on him every 2 hours. Another pause. "We are aware this is not ideal. It was a judgment call under time constraints." "What kind of time constraints require a man 46 hours post-abdominal surgery to remove his own drainage lines and leave a hospital? The kind I'm not able to fully detail on an unsecured line." His voice didn't change in register or rhythm. "What I can tell you is that the situation that put Garrett on that road on Tuesday night is not resolved, and his presence in a civilian hospital with an accessible public record created a vulnerability that we needed to close." Nora was standing now, at the window, looking at the empty street. "The chart entries," she said. "Hale's. The falsified chart entries? Yes." Something shifted in his tone. Not anger, not indignation, but the flat factual quality of a man stating what something is rather than what it feels like. They created a documented medical history for Garrett that is inaccurate in ways that matter to people who would have access to that record. Dr. Hale may not have understood what he was falsifying or why it was dangerous. That doesn't make it less dangerous. "Where is Hale?" A pause. "He is not reported to the hospital today. Beyond that, I don't have information I'm able to share." Nora processed this. "What do you need from me?" "Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., you're going to walk back into that conference room for your employment review. You're going to present your credentials and your evidence, and you're going to let the process work." Carrick's voice was steady and entirely without drama. "We will be sending a representative to that meeting. You won't know who they are when they walk in. That's intentional." "What kind of representative?" "The kind that closes things," he said. "Dr. Voss, or Ms. Voss, whichever you prefer, what you did on Tuesday night mattered to us in ways that go beyond Garrett's survival. The documentation you created, the imaging timestamp, the insistence on the correct diagnosis, those things are part of a record that is now part of a larger investigation. You did your job. We're going to do ours." She looked at the street. "Is he going to be all right?" she said. "Wills?" A pause that was half a beat longer than his previous ones. "He's been through worse," Carrick said. "He'd probably want me to say he's fine." "Is he fine?" "Not entirely, but he will be." The call ended. Nora stood at the window for a long time after that, long enough for a car to come down the street and pass and disappear, and another to follow it 10 minutes later. She thought about what Carrick had said and what he hadn't said, about the specific architecture of what he'd told her and the equally specific architecture of what he'd declined to. She thought about Hale not reporting to the hospital, about a black SUV with government plates leaving a parking lot at 10:15 in the morning. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep for a while, but eventually she did, which was an improvement over the previous 2 nights. And when the alarm went off at 7, she felt the difference between 4 hours and 6 in the way you feel it when your body has been running on insufficient reserves and has finally gotten enough to remember what enough feels like. She made coffee. She put on the same dark slacks and a different button-down, this one the color of charcoal. She drove to Harlow County General and parked in the staff lot out of habit, even though she wasn't staff at the moment, walked through the rear entrance, and arrived at the second-floor conference room at 8:58. Pruitt was there. Ashworth. Vance. Hale's chair was empty. Dr. Hale has been placed on administrative leave effective yesterday afternoon, Ashworth said, before Nora sat down. That is the extent of what I can share regarding his status at this time. Nora sat. Ashworth continued. We've received the credential verification from Johns Hopkins. We've also completed the telemetry review, and the documented inconsistencies between the monitor data and Dr. Hale's operative chart entries have been flagged for the Medical Records Compliance Office. She folded her hands. We're prepared to proceed today. The door opened. Nora didn't look immediately. She heard the sound of it, heard footsteps, more than one person, and gave herself 2 seconds before she turned because she'd been told she wouldn't know the representative when they arrived, and she wanted to approach the moment without anticipation distorting her read of it. She turned. A man in navy dress uniform, the rank insignia of a rear admiral at his collar. Not Carrick, someone younger, mid-50s, with the specific bearing of a career officer for whom formal dress was a working environment and not an occasion. Behind him, 2 other figures, a woman in a dark suit with a federal investigator's identification already visible on a lanyard, and a man in civilian clothes who was carrying a hard-sided case and did not introduce himself. Pruitt had stood up involuntarily. Even Ashworth had straightened. The admiral placed a folder on the table. Didn't sit. I'm Rear Admiral Stephen Okafor Huquan, he said. I'm here in connection with the Department of Defense Inspector General's review of medical documentation related to a federal matter that intersects with this proceeding. I've spoken with Admiral Carrick's office and with the hospital's legal counsel last evening. He looked at Vance, who nodded, slightly, in the way of someone confirming information they've already been made aware of. We're not here to conduct this review. That remains the hospital's process. We're here to provide documentation that is relevant to its conclusions. He opened the folder. On Tuesday night, a member of a special operations unit was transported to this facility following injuries sustained in the course of an active federal operation. His treatment, including the sequence of clinical decisions made in Trauma 1 between 11:48 p.m. and 12:34 a.m., is directly relevant to an ongoing investigation. He placed 3 documents on the table. These are certified copies of the room's monitor telemetry, retrieved directly from the hospital's data servers under the authority of the subpoena. They are authenticated and have chain of custody documentation. He placed 2 more documents. These are the operative notes filed by Dr. Hale at 1:15 a.m. Wednesday. And this, he placed a single page last, is a side-by-side comparison prepared by the IG office showing the specific discrepancies between the 2 records. The room was very quiet. Ashworth reached for the comparison document. She read it for 90 seconds. Her face didn't change, but her posture did, almost imperceptibly, a settling, a kind of arrival at a position she'd been approaching since yesterday. The falsification is explicit, she said. It wasn't a question. In the IG's assessment, yes, Okafor said. The chart entries attributed diagnostic decisions to Dr. Hale that the telemetry data does not support, and omitted the clinical actions of another provider whose interventions are documented in the room's own monitoring record. Nora was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her face as level as she could keep it, and she was doing this because the alternative was to let the weight of what was being said in this room show on her face, and she didn't want to do that here. Not in front of these people, not in this process, not as the person whose professional life this proceeding was determining. She'd known what she had done on Tuesday night. She'd known it when she did it. Hearing it confirmed by a federal investigation and a rear admiral in dress uniform was not the same as knowing it. It was louder. It had more altitude. It pressed on something in her chest that she'd been keeping carefully pressurized for 2.5 days. She kept her hands flat and her face level. "There's one additional item," Okafor said. The man in civilian clothes opened the hard-sided case and removed a laptop. He set it on the table and turned it so the panel could see the screen. On the screen was a document with a Department of Defense letterhead that Nora could read from where she sat. She could read it, but she read it twice anyway to make sure she was reading it correctly. It was a service record. Her service record. She had not seen this document in 7 years. She hadn't needed to. The information in it was not secret. It was classified at a level that meant most people would never request it, and most institutions would never think to look for it. But it wasn't sealed. And looking at it now from across a conference table in a Wyoming hospital, she had the very specific experience of seeing a version of herself that she'd spent years quietly setting aside. Nora Voss, Okafor read, not looking at the screen because he already knew what it said. Served 6 years with the United States Army Medical Corps, including 4 years attached to Special Operations Command in an advisory and forward surgical capacity. She holds the rank of Major, retired. She was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal and 2 Bronze Stars, one with Valor Device. He looked at the panel. She left the military to complete a nursing certification and has worked in civilian medicine for the past 4 years, most recently at this hospital. Pruitt made a sound that was not quite a word. "The reason I'm providing this record," Okafor continued, "is not to complicate this proceeding. It's to establish context. The provider who intervened on Tuesday night to save the life of a federal operative did not do so by accident or by luck or by overreaching the boundaries of her training. She did so because her training, the full scope of her training, most of which this institution was unaware of, was precisely adequate to the situation." He closed the folder. The Department of Defense's position is that her actions on Tuesday night were correct, competent, and necessary. The IG investigation will reflect that position. Ashworth was looking at Nora, not with the careful, assessing look she'd been using throughout this proceeding. Something different, the look of a person revising a mental model they'd been operating with and finding the revision substantial. "Major Voss," she said. "Ms. Voss is fine," Nora said. "I'm not active." "Ms. Voss." Ashworth's voice had something in it now that it hadn't had before. Not deference, not sentiment. More like the particular respect of a professional who recognizes competence at a level they hadn't previously accounted for. "I think we have what we need." The door opened again. Everyone looked. It was Jessamine, which was unexpected. Jessamine was not part of this proceeding and had no official reason to be in this hallway, but she was standing in the doorway with her ID badge visible and her expression carrying something that overrode the question of why she was there. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "Room 312, the patient who was discharged yesterday." She looked at Nora. "He's back. He came in through the ER 12 minutes ago. She stopped, steadied. "He's in bad shape. Whoever was managing his wound care, it wasn't adequate. He's running a fever of 103.4. His abdomen is rigid, and the ER attending thinks there's early peritonitis." Nobody moved for a half second. Then Nora was on her feet. "His blood cultures?" she said, already moving toward the door. "Pending. They just drew. Get me gloves and a gown and someone who can pull his original OR notes." She was through the door and in the hallway, moving fast. "And call whoever closed his abdomen on Wednesday morning. I need to know exactly what they used and where." Okafor stepped into the hallway behind her. "Dr. Voss?" She stopped, turned. "He asked for you specifically," Okafor said. "When he came in, he told the ER team your name." She looked at the Admiral for 1 second. Then she turned back and kept moving. Behind her in the conference room, Ashworth looked at the empty doorway where Nora had been. Then she looked at the documents on the table, the telemetry, the operative notes, the IG comparison, the service record with its Bronze Stars and its Distinguished Service Medal, and its 6 years of things that most people in this building would never fully understand. She picked up her pen. "Derek," she said, "let's talk about what this panel's determination is going to say." 3 floors below, in a trauma bay that was becoming familiar to her in the way of places you return to under pressure, Nora Voss pulled on gloves and looked at Garrett Wills, who was conscious, barely, his skin carrying the particular sheen of a fever that had been climbing for hours. his abdomen visibly distended in a way that told her, with cold precision, that she had maybe a narrow window before this stopped being a surgical problem and became something else. His eyes found her, dark and too bright with fever, and underneath that something that might have been relief. "You came back," he said. His voice was wrecked. "You pulled your own drainage lines," she said flatly, reaching for the ultrasound probe. "Had to." "You have peritonitis." "Yeah." A pause. A breath. "Figured." "I need you to stop talking and let me work." He closed his eyes. She pressed the probe to his abdomen and looked at the screen, and the screen showed her exactly what she'd feared and nothing she hadn't expected. And she set the probe down and turned to the ER attending and said, with the specific calm of a person who has no patience left for anything except what needs to happen right now, "Get me an OR. We need it in the next 20 minutes, or we're not going to have a choice about where we do this." The attending stared at her. Your status is being resolved upstairs as we speak. My credentials are documented and active, and I am telling you this patient needs a surgical intervention in the next 20 minutes. She held his gaze. "Call upstairs. Talk to Ashworth. Do it in the next 60 seconds, and then get me that OR." He reached for his phone. Nora looked back at Will's. His chest was rising and falling with the shallow, effortful rhythm of a body managing a serious infection, and the monitors above him were showing numbers she didn't like in a pattern she liked even less. And she thought about what Carrick had said on the phone last night. He's been through worse. And thought that worse was a relative term that didn't offer as much comfort as people tended to think it did. "Hey," she said. Wills opened his eyes. "Stay with me," she said. He looked at her with those dark, fever-bright eyes. "Not planning," he said, "to do otherwise." The attending ended his call, turned to her with an expression that had shifted from uncertain to something more urgent. "Dr. Ashworth wants you in the OR," she said. He stopped. She said, and I'm quoting, "Stop wasting time and go save him again." Nora was already moving. She got to the OR prep area in 4 minutes and was gowned and gloved in 3 more, and had her hands washed and was at the door when the surgical nurse fell into step beside her, a woman named Delacroix, who Nora had worked with exactly once before in a minor procedure, and who now looked at her with an expression that was professionally calm and personally intensely curious. "You're Major Voss?" Delacroix said. "I'm Miss Voss." She pushed through the OR door. "And I need you focused on me and not on whatever they told you upstairs." "Yes, ma'am," Delacroix said. And the ma'am came out with a reflex that didn't match a civilian context, and told Nora something about Delacroix's own history that she filed away and didn't comment on. The OR was ready. The anesthesiologist, Pham, a quiet man she'd passed in the hallways but never worked with, had his setup complete and looked up when she entered with the particular steadiness of someone who'd been briefed enough to know this was unusual and had decided to be useful rather than curious. "What are we looking at?" he said. "Peritonitis, postoperative, approximately 36 hours after initial abdominal repair. Source is likely the primary repair site. I need to assess for dehiscence and clean the cavity. Broad-spectrum antibiotics in now, if they're not already running." "Running since he hit the ER." "Good." She moved to the table. "Let's go." They brought Wills in 90 seconds later. He was conscious enough to know where he was. His eyes moved to her immediately when the OR doors opened, and he was wheeled through them, tracking her the way people track the one reliable fixed point in an uncertain environment. "You're going to be under in about 2 minutes," she said, leaning into his sightline. "When you wake up, this will be over." "You sure about that?" His voice was barely there. "I'm sure about the surgery," she said. "The rest we'll figure out." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, not quite anything she had a clean word for. And then Pham had the mask in position, and Wills's eyes went from fever-bright to closed in the space of a few breaths, and the room settled into the focused, particular quiet of a surgical team doing what it was trained to do. Nora opened her hands over the field. The source of the problem became clear within the first 4 minutes. A small dehiscence at the repair site, a gap in the closure that had allowed contamination into the peritoneal cavity. Exactly what she'd have predicted if she'd been asked to predict it, which was cold comfort, but was still information. She worked systematically, irrigating the cavity, debriding what needed debriding, re-establishing the closure with a redundancy that would hold under conditions less ideal than this OR. It was not a fast procedure. It was not a glamorous one. It was the kind of surgical work that looked like careful, methodical problem-solving because that is exactly what it was. And the team around her moved with a precision that surprised her given that most of them had never worked with her before. 58 minutes in, she looked at the monitors. Wills's fever was already beginning to respond to the antibiotics, dropping in the fractional, incremental way of a body that has been given what it needed and is starting to use it. His pressure was stable. His rhythm was steady. "Closing," she said. Delacroix handed her sutures without being asked, already anticipating, and Nora registered this with the part of her brain that wasn't occupied with the closing and thought again about that man in the corridor and thought she understood it a little better now. She was 6 sutures from done when the OR doors opened. She didn't look up. Nothing opened an OR door during an active procedure unless it was important enough to override the standard protocol that said OR doors did not open during active procedures. "Dr. Voss," a voice she didn't recognize. "I apologize for the interruption. I'm Special Agent Dana Corda, DOD Inspector General. I need to inform you that Marcus Hale has been located." Nora placed the 6th suture. "I'm finishing a closure." "Of course. I wanted you to know he attempted to access and delete the hospital's imaging records remotely this morning, using his administrator credentials. The deletion was intercepted by our forensic team, which had the hospital's servers under monitoring since yesterday." A pause. "He's been taken into custody." Nora placed the 7th suture. "He'll face federal charges for tampering with medical records that are material to a DOD investigation," Corta continued. "The state medical board has been notified. His hospital privileges are suspended effective immediately pending the outcome." 8th suture. 9th. "Miss Voss," Corta's voice was quieter. "We have everything we need. The case against him is complete." Nora tied off the final suture and straightened and looked at the monitors one more time. Stable, 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 everything that should be doing what it should be doing, and then she looked at the woman in the doorway. "Thank you," she said. "Please close the door on your way out." Court looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and closed the door. Delacroix was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who was feeling something they'd decided not to show. Fom said nothing, but something in his stillness communicated that he'd heard everything and was filing it carefully. Nora stripped her gloves. "Let's get him to recovery." She walked out of the OR at 11:43 a.m. and stood in the scrub corridor and let the door close behind her and stood there for a moment with her back against the wall, eyes on the ceiling, hands at her sides. Not thinking about anything in particular, letting the last hour and a half, the last 4 days really, have a moment of being simply over before the next thing began. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she didn't have saved. The same unknown Wyoming area code as Carrick's call last night. It said, "Conference room. When you're ready, take your time." She looked at the message for a moment, then she pushed off the wall, straightened her shirt, and started walking. She was almost at the stairwell when she stopped, because coming down the corridor toward her, not fast, not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories, was Garrett Wills. Still in his hospital gown, IV pole beside him, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been anesthetized less than 2 hours ago and whose body had opinions about what he was currently doing, supported on one side by a Navy officer in dress uniform she didn't recognize, and on the other by nobody. Because apparently Garrett Wills had decided that the other side was his own responsibility. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped too. They looked at each other in the corridor under the fluorescent lights, and the IV pole beeped once, and somewhere down the hall a monitor chimed, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You're supposed to be in recovery," she said. "I know." He wasn't apologizing. His voice was still wrecked, but clearer than it had been in the ER. "I needed to—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that was not what she expected from a man with his particular economy of expression. "I needed to be upright when I said this." She waited. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that had found her every time she'd walked into a room, across a trauma bay, across an OR, across a corridor, As though her location was a variable his internal system updated automatically. "Whatever happens in that conference room," he said, "I want you to know that I will personally ensure that every person responsible for what happened to you this week, all of it, the suspension, the false report, all of it, faces every consequence that exists for it." He said it with the same flat precision he used for everything, which somehow made it more rather than less. "That's not a gesture, that's a commitment." Nora looked at him. She thought about what the right response was. She thought about professionalism and about boundaries, and about the fact that she was a civilian nurse with a medical degree standing in a hospital corridor talking to a man who had classified tattoos and a Navy scar and had just come out of her second surgery in 4 days and was standing upright against what had to be every reasonable protest from his own body because he decided it was necessary to be standing when he said this. "Go back to recovery," she said. He held her gaze for another moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and turned, and the officer beside him steadied the IV pole, and they moved slowly back down the corridor. Nora watched them go. Then she turned toward the stairwell, and on the second floor, in a beige conference room under fluorescent lights, Rear Admiral Thomas Carrick was sitting at the table with a folder open in front of him and 3 documents laid out in a row, documents that contained, between them, the complete, irrefutable account of everything that had happened in this building since Tuesday night, waiting for a woman who had saved a man's life twice and been punished for it once and was about to find out whether the process she'd been asked to trust had been worth trusting. He checked his watch. He was not worried about whether she'd come. He'd read her file. She took the stairs, not because the elevator was slow, it wasn't, but because she needed the 30 seconds of stairwell between the surgical floor and the second level, the particular nowhere of a fire exit between floors, to let her face do whatever it needed to do before she walked into that room. She'd been keeping her expression level for 4 days. She could keep it level for whatever came next. She just needed 30 seconds first. She took them. Then she pushed through the door. The conference room looked different with Carrick in it. Not because he'd changed anything. The same fluorescent lights, the same beige walls, the same long table, but because he had the quality of certain people who alter the character of a space simply by occupying it. He was in his 60s, lean without being spare, with gray at his temples, and the kind of posture that didn't require effort because it had been structural for so long it was simply how he was built. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected, and gestured to the chair across from him, which she took. Ashworth was there. Pruitt, looking like a man who had aged several years since Monday. Vance, who had been on the phone constantly since the morning and looked it. Special Agent Corda had returned and was seated to Carrick's left with a tablet and a closed expression. The Navy officer who'd been with Wills in the corridor was there too, introduced as Commander Reese, who handled, apparently, administrative matters for Carrick's office, which was a description so vague it explained nothing and probably meant a great deal. The folder in front of Carrick was thicker than the one Okafor had brought that morning. "Ms. Voss," Carrick said, "thank you for coming up directly." "You said take my time," she said. "I didn't." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "No, you didn't." He opened the folder. "I want to walk through what we have and what happens next. And I want to do it with this panel present because what's documented here intersects directly with the hospital's employment proceeding. And I think it serves everyone to have that conversation in one room." Ashworth nodded. Pruitt had a legal pad. Vance had closed her phone and was paying attention with the full, specific focus of someone who has decided that this is the conversation that matters. Marcus Hale, Carrick said, attempted to delete 6 files from Harlow County General's imaging and records server at 9:14 this morning. The files were the abdominal ultrasound from Tuesday night at 11:52 p.m., the Trauma 1 monitor telemetry from the same period, the original triage nursing notes, 2 OR records, and the patient's initial lab panel. He said this without heat, the way a person reads a list of facts that are consequential enough not to require editorial addition. Our forensic team had the server under passive monitoring since yesterday under the authority of the IG subpoena. The deletion was intercepted before it executed. All 6 files are intact. "He had remote administrator access?" Vance said. "He did. Standard for department chiefs at this institution, as I understand it." Carrick looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the table. "Yes. Department chiefs have remote access for administrative functions. That access has been revoked as of this morning, court said. Across all current department chiefs as a precautionary measure, pending a security audit. Pruitt wrote something on his legal pad. His handwriting, from where Nora sat, looked like a man making a note he wished he didn't have to make. The attempted deletion is a federal offense, Carrick continued, specifically obstruction of a DOD Inspector General investigation and tampering with records under active federal subpoena. Those charges are being prepared independently of whatever action the State Medical Board and this hospital take. He turned a page. The IG's review of the original chart entries, the operative notes Hale filed at 1:15 a.m. Wednesday, is complete. The finding is that the entries constitute deliberate falsification of medical records with the intent to conceal clinical error and reassign documented actions from one provider to another. The room was quiet in the particular way of people hearing something confirmed that they'd already known and finding that confirmation heavier than the knowing. Specifically, Carrick said, Hale's notes credited himself with the diagnostic identification of the abdominal hemorrhage. They credited his team with the vascular intervention. They omitted Ms. Voss's name entirely, and they included a single reference to nursing staff that described an intervention by an unidentified nurse that had, quote, complicated the procedure and required correction. He closed that section of the folder. The monitor telemetry and the imaging timestamp document the actual sequence of events with a precision that makes the falsification unambiguous. This is not a matter of differing clinical interpretations. The records say different things, and one of them is a lie constructed after the fact. Nora was sitting with her hands flat on the table. She was looking at the middle distance between herself and Carrick, not at the folder, not at Ashworth. She was listening, and she was keeping her breathing even, and she was doing these things with the concentration of a person who has learned that the way you carry yourself in the moment of vindication matters as much as the vindication itself. Ms. Voss. Carrick looked at her directly. I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that your answer has no bearing on any of this proceeding or any of the federal actions. This is a separate question. She looked at him. When you performed the vascular intervention on Tuesday night, when you made the decision to step in, did you know the full scope of what you were walking into? The federal dimension, the investigation, what Garrett's presence in this hospital meant. She thought about the scar, about the tattoo, about the specific cold calculation she'd run in the 5 seconds between seeing his blood pressure at 48 and deciding to move. No, she said. I knew he'd been somewhere that left marks. I knew his chart was going to be a problem. I didn't know the rest. You intervened anyway. His pressure was at 48. Carrick looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression had the quality of a man arriving at a conclusion he'd already suspected. Right, he said. He turned to Ashworth. I think we should discuss reinstatement. What followed was not fast. Institutional processes are not fast by design. They move at the speed of documentation and verification and the specific caution of people who know that decisions made in conference rooms have consequences that outlast the meeting. Ashworth led it. She was methodical, which Nora had come to understand was simply how she worked, and methodical in this context meant thorough, which meant complete, which meant that by the time it was done, there were no gaps that anyone could later point to. Nora's suspension was formally rescinded. Her employment record was amended to reflect that the suspension had been found to be without clinical basis. Her nursing credentials were confirmed active. Her medical credentials, the Hopkins degree, the board certifications, were added to her personnel file by her explicit consent, which Ashworth asked for directly, and which Nora gave with the understanding that she was consenting to their presence in the record, and not to any change in her job title or clinical role. We would like to discuss your role more broadly, Ashworth said toward the end of this. At a separate time, not today, but I want to put that on the table. Okay, Nora said. Today, I just want you to have your badge back. Pruitt slid it across the table. Harlow County General / Nora Voss / RN, slightly scuffed at the corner from where she'd set it on the nurse's station counter 3 nights ago. She picked it up. Didn't clip it on yet. Held it. Thank you, she said to the room generally, and meant it without making it more than it was. Carrick stayed after the others filed out, Ashworth with her folder, Pruitt with his legal pad, Vance already on her phone again in the hallway. Corta left with Commander Reese. The conference room went from crowded to just the two of them, which felt like a gear change. "Hale," she said, "walk me through what happens. Federal charges first. Obstruction and records tampering are the clearest, because we have the server logs and the attempted deletion is documented precisely. Those carry significant weight independent of anything else." Carrick closed the folder. The State Medical Board has been notified and has opened its own investigation into the original chart falsification and into the clinical decision-making on Tuesday night. They'll move at their own speed, which is slower than federal prosecution. His hospital privileges are gone as of this morning, which you know. His malpractice insurer has been notified. Standard protocol when a physician faces federal charges. That notification alone will trigger their own review. His license. The board will suspend it pending their investigation. Whether it's reinstated after depends on their findings, but given the documented record, Carrick paused. It's unlikely to be a straightforward process for him. If the federal charges result in conviction, the board's path is clear. She thought about Tuesday night, about the incision Hale had made in the wrong place while the monitor screamed and Wills's blood pressure fell. She thought about the chart entries he'd filed at 1:15 a.m., with her name removed and his own positioned at the center of a story that hadn't happened. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the specific, complicated weight of a situation arriving at its correct conclusion after having been wrong for several days, which was not the same thing as feeling good. "There's something else," Carrick said. She looked at him. "The board is going to receive, as part of the IG investigation's findings, a full accounting of Hale's clinical record at this hospital for the past 3 years. Not just Tuesday night." He said this carefully, the way you say things that have implications beyond the sentence itself. The IG review found, as a secondary finding, related to the question of whether the falsification of Garrett's records was an isolated incident or a pattern, that there are 11 other cases in the past 36 months where Hale's chart entries show inconsistencies with the room monitoring data. The chair under Nora became more present somehow. She was aware of sitting. 11, she said. 11 documented. The review is ongoing. Carrick's voice was even. Most of them appear to involve credit reassignment, documenting his own clinical decisions as primary when the monitoring record suggests the intervention sequence was different. In 2 cases, there are discrepancies significant enough that the IG has referred them for separate review related to patient outcomes. She sat with this. 11 cases. 36 months. A department chief at a regional hospital in a mid-sized Wyoming city, systematically adjusting the written record of what happened in his OR to position himself at the center of events that hadn't always gone the way the chart said they went. She thought about the nurses who had worked those cases, about the residents, if there had been residents, about the other providers whose names might have been absent from records that should have included them. Were there adverse outcomes, she said? In the 2 referred cases, yes. Carrick's face didn't change. The review will determine the extent to which the falsified records interfered with subsequent care. She looked at the table. This was the part that didn't feel like vindication at all. This was the part that felt like a different kind of weight. The particular heaviness of understanding that a problem you'd encountered was not a problem that started with you, that it had been running longer and deeper, and had touched other people in ways that were still being counted. "Okay," she said finally. It was not an adequate response to the information, and she knew it. It was the only word available. Carrick stood. "I'll be in Denton Falls through the weekend. If you have questions, anything, clinical, procedural, about the federal process, you have my number." "How's Wills?" she said. "Stable. Annoyed at the IV." Carrick allowed himself a small, dry expression. "He's going to be fine. It'll take time, but he's going to be fine." He shouldn't have left the hospital yesterday. "No," Carrick agreed. "He shouldn't have. That's a conversation he and I are also going to have." He left. Nora sat alone in this conference room for 3 minutes and 30 seconds. She knew because she watched the clock on the wall, not for any particular reason, just because it was there and gave her eyes somewhere to be. Then she stood up, clipped her badge onto her shirt, and walked out. The 3rd-floor corridor was ordinary. Monitors beeping at their regular intervals, a dietary cart parked outside a room. Jessamine at the nurse's station with her head down over a chart, and her shoulders carrying the specific tension of someone who had been running on adrenaline and focus for 4 days and was only now beginning to register that the ground had changed. She looked up when Nora came through the door. She looked at the badge. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her face did everything. Relief and something fiercer underneath it, something that had been waiting for this specific outcome with more investment than she'd probably admitted to herself. And the combination of those things made her look, for a moment, very young and very certain at the same time. "You're back," Jessamine said. "I'm back." Nora looked at the station. "What have we got?" They had a full floor. They had a 72-year-old post-op hip replacement in 308 who'd had a difficult night and needed reassessment. They had a teenager in 315 with a complicated appendectomy recovery, and parents who were handling the anxiety by asking the same questions repeatedly and needed someone to answer them with enough patience that they could actually hear the answers. They had 3 other patients with variously complicated situations, and they had the ordinary, specific texture of a hospital floor going about its work, which Nora stepped back into with the focused attention of someone for whom this work was not a backdrop, but the actual thing. She spent the rest of the morning being a nurse, not a former Army major, not a Johns Hopkins physician, not the subject of a federal investigation or an employment review or a 4-day institutional crisis. She took vitals and reviewed charts and talked to the teenager's parents until they started actually listening, and she checked on the hip replacement and adjusted his pain management protocol and documented everything carefully, and the work had the quality that good work has when you've been kept from it. A solidity, a realness, a sense of being in the right location, doing the right thing. At 12:40 p.m., Jessamine appeared in the doorway of the hip replacement's room with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally anything but. "There are people downstairs," she said. Nora finished her notation. "What kind of people?" "Media, 2 vans, and—" Jessamine paused, choosing words. "Someone from administration came up to let you know. Dr. Hale was taken out of his home in handcuffs this morning. There's footage." Nora set down the chart. She had known this was coming in the abstract, the same way she'd known all of it was coming in the abstract, and the abstract had not fully prepared her for the specific. Hale in handcuffs, footage of it. Media vans outside the hospital where his name was still on the banner over the entrance, or had been. She didn't know if they'd taken it down yet. "Anyone asking for comment from me?" she said. "The hospital communications office wants to know your preference." "My preference is no comment." She picked the chart back up. "Pass that along." "Okay." Jessamine didn't move immediately. "Nora." She looked up. "It's on the local news," Jessamine said carefully. They don't have your name yet, but they have his, and they're describing the case, the falsified records, the patient." She stopped. "People here know it's you." Nora looked at her. "The staff," Jessamine said. "Everyone knows. By this morning, everyone knew, and—" She seemed to be deciding something. "Delacroix told people about the OR this morning, about what Agent Corda said. She didn't mean to cause problems, I don't think. She just—" "It's fine," Nora said. "I just wanted you to know what you're walking into when you go to the break room." "Jessamine," she held her gaze. "It's fine. Go check on 315. Jessamine went. Nora finished the chart notation, placed it correctly, and walked to the break room. 3 nurses she recognized from other rotations were there, along with a radiology tech and one of the ward clerks. The conversation that had been happening stopped when she walked in. Not in a hostile way. The opposite of hostile, actually, which was in some ways harder to navigate. There was a quality in the room that she recognized from other contexts, other situations, other moments when she'd been in a position of having done something in front of witnesses and then having to exist afterward in the same space as those witnesses. "Morning," she said, going for the coffee. "Morning," said one of the nurses, a woman named Rita, who'd worked nights for 12 years and had the particular directness of someone who'd long since stopped filtering for social comfort. For what it's worth, most of us knew what he was doing. Not specifically, but we knew the type. Nora poured coffee. Most institutions have one. "Some have more than one," Rita said. We just had the one that we know of." The room had relaxed by a fraction. Not fully. There was still the awkwardness of people who weren't sure what the correct register was for a situation they didn't have a script for. But enough. 11 cases, the radiology tech said. He was young, maybe 24, and looked slightly stunned the way people look when information reorganizes a significant portion of their professional reality. Is that real? That's what they're saying. That's what's been referred for review, Nora said. Whether 11 is the final number, I don't know. I ran imaging for him, the tech said. For 4 years. I ran imaging for him and… He stopped, shook his head. Nora drank her coffee and didn't fill the silence. There wasn't anything useful she could add to it. She was back on the floor 20 minutes later when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, different from Carrick's. She answered, Ms. Voss. A woman's voice, clipped, professional, with the particular vocal quality of someone who was working from a list. This is Director Paulson's office, Wyoming State Medical Board. The director would like to speak with you at your earliest availability regarding the active investigation and your potential status as a brief pause. As a witness, and also as a licensed physician in the state. Would sometime today work? Tomorrow morning, Nora said, 9 a.m. We'll schedule that, thank you. She hung up and kept moving. The afternoon brought its own ordinary crises. The teenager's fever spiked and required reassessment, and a call to the attending, which resolved without drama but cost 2 hours. The hip replacement needed his wife talk through the physical therapy timeline because his wife had read something online that was wrong in ways that were going to cause problems, if not corrected. An admission came through from the ER, a 40-year-old woman with diabetic complications who needed the specific kind of careful attention that diabetic complications require, which was considerable. Nora worked through all of it with the focused, sometimes irritating patience of a person who is good at their job and knows that being good at it requires the same quality of attention on the unremarkable cases as on the dramatic ones. At 4:15, Pruitt appeared on the floor. He found her outside the diabetic patient's room and stood with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who had something to say and wasn't entirely sure how to calibrate it. "The banner's down," he said. She looked at him. "Outside. Hale's photo. We took it down this afternoon." He paused. "I want you to know that I…" He stopped, started again. "I handled Tuesday night the way I was supposed to handle it procedurally, and I think that was wrong. Not just technically wrong. Wrong." She considered him. "You were doing your job. My job put you on suspension for saving someone's life. Your job also meant you told me to get the imaging time-stamped in writing," she said. "Which you didn't say explicitly, but which is what you meant. And that timestamp is what made the rest of this possible." Pruitt looked at her. He seemed to be deciding whether to take this as absolution or whether it was simply true. "The board. Ashworth, she's going to want to talk to you about a formal role in the department, a senior clinical position." She mentioned it. "She means it seriously." "I know." Nora looked down the corridor. "Tell her I'll think about it." "That's all?" "That's all for now." Pruitt nodded. He seemed to want to say more and to have concluded that more wasn't the right amount. He left the way he'd come. At 6 p.m, coming off the floor with her bag over her shoulder and her badge in her pocket rather than on her shirt because the shift was done, she passed the nurse's station and found Jessamine still there. Technically off rotation, clearly having stayed because she didn't want to leave without knowing the ending of the day. "Go home," Nora said. "I will. Jessamine reached under the desk and produced a folded piece of paper. "This came up from the 3rd floor about an hour ago, from room 312. Well, they put him back in 312 after the recovery. He asked the floor nurse to bring it to you." Nora took the paper. She didn't unfold it in front of Jessamine. She took it out to the parking lot in the cold evening air and stood beside her car under a sky that had gone the color of old pewter and unfolded it. Handwriting she didn't recognize, done slowly by someone who was working around IV lines. Blocky, deliberate letters. It said, "Carrick told me about the 11 cases. I'm sorry you're carrying that. Not your weight to carry, but I know you will anyway. GW." And below that, in smaller letters, "They're offering you something. Take it or don't. But don't decide based on what happened this week. Decide based on what you want to be doing in 10 years. She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her jacket pocket, and got in her car. She sat there for a moment in the cold with the engine off and thought about what he'd written, about what she wanted to be doing in 10 years, a question she hadn't let herself sit with for a while, in the way that people avoid sitting with questions that don't have clear answers, because the absence of a clear answer in the present feels more manageable than the weight of an unclear future. She started the engine. She drove home through Denton Falls in the early dark, through streets that were going about their Thursday evening in the uncomplicated way of a city that didn't know or particularly care what had happened inside one of its buildings this week. She parked. She went inside. She ate something she didn't think about: eggs, toast, the default meal of the person who is hungry and not interested in cooking. And she sat at the kitchen table where she'd sat 3 nights ago in the dark, thinking about a scar and a tattoo and a man she didn't know yet. She thought about the 11 cases, not about her own case, not about the badge in her pocket or the conversation with Carrick or what Ashworth was going to propose. She thought about 11 other rooms, 11 other nights, 11 other patients whose charts had been written by a man who edited the truth to protect himself. And she thought about what that meant for those patients, who their records said had cared for them, and what they'd been told about their own care, and whether any of them had ever been in a position to know that the official story was different from what had actually happened. She thought about the residents, if there had been residents, about the nurses who might have done something right on those nights and never had it documented. Her phone rang at 8:47 p.m. "Carrick, I thought you'd want to know," he said without preamble. Hale made a statement to federal investigators this afternoon, through counsel. He's declining to answer questions, which is his right, but the statement itself, a brief pause that carried something in it. His attorney submitted a written statement asserting that the chart entries on Tuesday night were not falsified, but reflected his good faith clinical interpretation of the events, and that any discrepancy between the entries and the monitoring data reflects the limitations of digital records rather than intentional misrepresentation. Nora was quiet. "He's going to fight it," she said. "His attorney is going to fight it." "Yes." Carrick's voice was even. "The argument won't succeed. The server logs documenting the attempted deletion are irrefutable, and that charge is entirely independent of the chart falsification. You cannot claim good faith interpretation and simultaneously attempt to delete the records that disprove your interpretation. The deletion attempt is, if anything, more damaging than the falsification itself, but it means a longer process." "It means a longer process," he confirmed. "Federal cases move at their own speed. The board investigation will be separate and may conclude sooner." He paused again. "I wanted you to know before you read it somewhere else." "Thank you." "Get some sleep, Ms. Voss." She hung up. She thought about a longer process, about the specific quality of a longer process, the way it stretched across time, requiring you to hold the tension of an unresolved situation while also living your regular life, going to work, doing the ordinary necessary things. She'd done longer processes before. She knew how they felt. She went to bed at 10 and slept 6 hours, which was the most she'd managed since Monday. And when the alarm went off at 6, she lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest. She was making coffee when her phone buzzed. Jessamine. Check the news. She put down the coffee cup and pulled up the local station's website on her phone. The headline was not about Hale. Or it was about Hale, but it was about more than Hale now. The story had expanded overnight, the way stories do when journalists start pulling at the edges and finding that the edges connect to other things. A second byline on the story. A source described as a former hospital staff member. 11 cases referenced by number, not by detail. The IG investigation's secondary findings had apparently reached someone who'd reached a reporter. But that wasn't the part that made her set the phone down on the counter and stand very still for a moment. The part was the last 3 paragraphs. A source close to the investigation had confirmed that the nurse at the center of the original complaint, suspended by the hospital days ago at the department chief's request, held active medical credentials including a degree from Johns Hopkins and board certifications in emergency medicine and trauma surgery. The source had also confirmed her prior military service in a special operations adjacent role, without specifying details that would have required classification review. Her name was in the article. Nora Voss. Paragraph 9. She picked up the phone and read the paragraph again. Then she set it down and poured her coffee and thought about the fact that by the time she walked into the hospital this morning, everyone who hadn't already known would know. Not just the staff, Everyone. She drank her coffee. Then her phone rang again. Not Jessamine this time. Not Carrick. A number she recognized this time. The Wyoming State Medical Board. 6 hours before their scheduled 9 a.m. call. She answered. Ms. Voss? Director Paulson herself. Nora had spoken to her once, 2 years ago, during a license renewal query. She had the voice of a woman who ran a regulatory body and had done so long enough that the voice had taken on the institutional weight of the body itself. I apologize for the early hour. I've seen the news this morning, and I want to talk to you before the day gets ahead of us. I'm listening, Nora said. The board's investigation of Marcus Hale is proceeding. His license is suspended pending that investigation, which I expect you know. Paulson paused. What I'm calling about this morning is something separate. We received information yesterday evening from the IG's office, a secondary referral related to the broader review of Dr. Hale's case history. Another pause. We believe that 2 patients may have experienced adverse outcomes that were directly affected by falsified or incomplete chart entries. In one case, a patient received a treatment course that was based on an incorrect operative summary. In the second case, Paulson stopped. The pause was longer than her others. In the second case, she said, the patient died 8 months ago. The board is opening a separate investigation into whether the falsified records contributed to that outcome. Nora stood in her kitchen in the early morning with the coffee cup in her hand and felt the weight of that sentence move through her like a change in atmospheric pressure. A patient had died 8 months ago, and somewhere in a chart that Marcus Hale had written to protect himself, the true sequence of events had been buried under a version that served him instead. I see, she said, because there was nothing else to say. I'm telling you this, Paulson said carefully, because you're likely to be called as a witness in the board's proceedings. Your direct experience of Dr. Hale's conduct in a clinical setting is relevant, and because, she paused again, because I think you should understand the full scope of what you walked into on Tuesday night, not just what it meant for you, what it was already. Nora set the coffee cup down. Thank you for telling me, she said. We'll talk at 9, Paulson said. Take care of yourself this morning. The call ended. Nora stood in the kitchen and looked at the counter and thought about 8 months ago. About a patient she would never know, in a room she had never been in a situation she had not been present for. About a chart that said one thing while a monitor somewhere had recorded something else, and the gap between those 2 records, the gap that Hale had maintained and protected and expanded until Tuesday night, when he'd tried to expand it one more time and found that this particular patient came with attachments he hadn't accounted for. She thought about what Carrick had said. The attempted deletion is more damaging than the falsification itself. He'd tried to delete 6 files. He had not deleted them. And the reason he had not deleted them, the specific reason the server was under monitoring, the reason the forensic team had been there to intercept, was a Navy SEAL on Route 9 on a Tuesday night with a sheared mesenteric artery and a scar that a night rotation nurse had recognized from a different life. The chain of it was long and specific and had required, at every link, someone doing the right thing at a cost that wasn't guaranteed to be worth it. She thought about the patient 8 months ago, and she thought about that chain, and she understood, not comfortably, not cleanly, but completely, that the job she'd done on Tuesday night had mattered in ways that went in both directions through time. She picked up her badge from the counter. She clipped it on. She picked up her keys, and she was almost to the door when her phone buzzed one more time, not a call, a text, from Carrick's number. It said, Hale's attorney filed a motion this morning to have the IG investigation scope limited on national security grounds, claiming that the patient's identity creates a classified dimension that compromises his defense. She read it. Then, motion will be denied, but I want you to know it was filed. She stood at her door and read the message twice and understood what it meant. That Hale's legal strategy was shifting, that he or his attorney had found what they thought might be a structural vulnerability in the case against him, a thread related to Wills's identity and the classified nature of whatever operation had put him on that road, and they were pulling it to see if anything came loose. She thought about what would happen if something did come loose. She thought about the patient 8 months ago. She opened her door and walked out into the cold morning. Behind her, in a hospital across the city, in a file that Hale's attorney didn't know existed yet, that no one outside the IG's office and Admiral Carrick's team knew existed yet, There was a document that had been compiled over the last 48 hours from sources that Hale had no access to and no awareness of. It was not the telemetry. It was not the imaging. It was not any of the records from Harlow County General. It was a consolidated report from 3 separate hospitals in 2 states where Marcus Hale had held privileges before coming to Denton Falls. And what it showed, what it had been showing for 11 years across 3 institutions, in a pattern that had never been assembled into a single document until a federal investigation gave someone the authority and the reason to look, was not going to survive a motion to limit the IG's scope. It was going to end one. The motion was denied by 11 a.m. Nora learned this from Carrick in a text that arrived while she was on the phone with Director Paulson, which meant she was receiving 2 pieces of institutional information simultaneously and had to hold both of them with equal steadiness, which was manageable but required concentration. Paulson was walking her through the board's timeline for the expanded investigation, the 2 adverse outcome cases, the process for witness interviews, what Nora's participation would look like and when. Carrick's text sat on her screen while she listened, and she read it in the pauses and processed it in the background the way you process things that are important but not urgent, which this wasn't anymore. The motion had been filed as a delay tactic and had been identified as one and had been dismissed accordingly. That chapter closed. She finished the call with Paulson at 9:42, made a note of the dates she'd been given, and put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. The floor was full. Friday mornings at Harlow County General had a specific character, the accumulation of a week's worth of cases pressing against the reality that weekend staffing was thinner and the rhythm of the building changed, more weight on fewer shoulders, the particular vigilance required when the institutional support structure was lighter. Nora moved through it with the attention it required and didn't spend the morning inside her own head, which was a choice and one that cost something but was also the right one, because the people on this floor didn't need a nurse who was managing a parallel internal narrative. They needed a nurse who was present. The teenager in 315, his name was Cody, she'd learned, 17 soccer player, the kind of kid who handled physical pain stoically and emotional stress by talking too much, had turned a corner overnight. His fever was down, his appetite had returned in the specific aggressive way of adolescent boys who'd been deprived of food for several days, and he was trying to negotiate an earlier discharge with anyone who'd engage him on the topic. 2 more days, she told him. I've been here 6 days already. You've been here 4 days, and your body has opinions about the appendectomy that it hasn't fully expressed yet. 2 more days. My mom keeps crying every time she looks at me. That's not a medical problem. That's a mom problem. 2 days, Cody. He slumped back against his pillow with the theatrical suffering of a 17-year-old who knew he wasn't going to win this and had decided to register his objection anyway. His mother, sitting in the corner chair, caught Nora's eye over his head and mouthed "thank you" with the exhausted gratitude of a woman who had been in a hospital room for 4 days and needed someone else to be the wall for a few minutes. Nora moved on. She was reviewing this diabetic patient's morning labs when Jessamine appeared at her elbow. "He's asking for you," Jessamine said. Nora didn't look up from the chart. "Wills. Room 312. The floor nurse said he's been asking since 7. His drain output this morning?" Jessamine handed her a secondary chart sheet without being asked. "Decreasing, appropriate for post-op day 3 on the 2nd procedure." Nora reviewed the numbers. "Fever? 99.1, down from yesterday's 103. Okay." She handed the chart back and finished her notation. "I'll go when I finish these labs." She finished the labs and signed off on the diabetic patient's adjusted insulin protocol and walked down the corridor to 312 at 10:23. Wills was sitting up at 45 degrees, which was more than the 30 he'd been managing yesterday, and the improvement in his color was visible, still not right, still carrying the specific pallor of someone whose body was spending most of its resources on healing rather than appearance, but no longer the wax pale of a man who'd been in serious danger. The IV was in his left arm. The new drainage lines were taped securely, and he was, she noticed, leaving them alone. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." His voice was less wrecked. 3 days of hydration and rest had done some of the work that rest was supposed to do. She pulled the chair closer and sat down. "Drain output is down. Fever dropped 2 points overnight. You ate breakfast?" "Something they called oatmeal." "Did you eat it?" "Most of it." "Good." She looked at the drainage lines, the IV site, the color of his skin, conducting an assessment the way she always did, not as a formality, but as the actual business of finding out how someone was doing. "You asked for me 3 times this morning." "Twice," he said. "The third time was Carrick checking in, and I mentioned your name as context, not as a request." She looked at him. "You read the news," he said. "I did. The story about the consolidated report from the other hospitals, that's going to break today." He said it without drama, as information that was relevant and that she should have. Carrick's office didn't release it, but someone on the IG team has a relationship with the journalist, and the timeline matched up. It'll be out by afternoon. She absorbed this. 11 years, at least. 3 hospitals. He paused. They found a pattern going back to his residency. Incomplete documentation, credit reassignment, a discrepancy in a surgical outcome that was reviewed and closed at the time, but looks different in context. He looked at her directly. This wasn't about Tuesday night. Tuesday night was when someone finally had the mechanism to look. She thought about what Paulson had said. "I think you should understand the full scope of what you walked into." "The patient who died," she said. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, just a settling, a recognition that she'd gone to the hardest part of it, rather than staying with the easier pieces. 53 years old, post-surgical complications that the chart attributed to a pre-existing condition. The IG's medical reviewer looked at the original OR record and found that the complication was consistent with an error that occurred during the procedure, an error that Hale's notes didn't document. Did anyone raise it at the time? A resident. Wills's voice was even, but the evenness had weight in it. A second-year resident flagged an inconsistency in the chart to the attending of record, which was Hale. Hale reviewed it and signed off on the existing documentation and told the resident her read was incorrect. He paused. She left that hospital 8 months later, transferred to a program in Oregon. Her transfer record includes a note about difficulty adjusting to the institutional culture. Nora sat with this for a moment. A 20-something resident, 2 years into a medical career, who had seen something wrong and said so and been told she was incorrect and had gone somewhere else, who had done what you were supposed to do and absorbed the consequences of doing it and moved on because the alternative was to keep fighting a system that had already told her how much her objection was worth. "What happened to her?" she said. "She's a surgical attending in Portland now." His voice carried something, not quite warmth, not exactly, but something adjacent. "She was contacted by the IG's office 3 days ago. She remembered the case. She remembered the chart. She still has her original notes from the flagged inconsistency." Nora looked at him. "She kept them," she said. 8 years, he said. "She kept them for 8 years. The room was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of 2 people sitting with a piece of information that was heavy and also, in its way, something else. A 20-something resident who had known something was wrong and had written it down and kept the paper for 8 years in case anyone ever needed to know. That was not a comfortable story. It was a true one, which was different. "Get some sleep this afternoon," Nora said. She stood. "Your body is still doing significant work even when you're lying still." "Voss." He said her name the same way he always did, as a full stop, as a request for one more moment of attention. She stopped. "What are you going to do after this settles?" She looked at him. "I'm going to work my shift. After that, I'm going to go home and probably eat eggs again because I haven't been to the grocery store since Monday." She picked up her stethoscope. "Ask me in 6 months." He looked at her with those steady eyes. "Ashworth's offer. I told her I'd think about it. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now." She moved toward the door. "Stop pulling at your IV when you shift positions. I can see you doing it." She left before he could respond, which was a pattern she was aware of and not particularly inclined to change. The consolidated report broke at 2:17 p.m. She was in the break room when Jessamine found her, and Jessamine's face carried the expression of someone delivering news that was significant and complicated in equal measure. Not good news, not bad news, but the kind of news that redraws the landscape of something you thought you understood. The story was thorough. The journalist had done the work. 3 hospitals, 11 years of documented inconsistencies, the resident in Portland who had spoken on the record with her name, the 2 adverse outcome cases that the Wyoming board was now investigating, And the Tuesday night incident at Harlow County General told in a sequence that was accurate in its facts and for the first time complete. Nora's name was in the fourth paragraph, not as a subject, as a source of action, the provider whose intervention on Tuesday night had created the mechanism for the broader investigation to occur. The article didn't sensationalize it. It stated it factually, which was the right approach, and also the more unsettling one, because facts stated plainly have a different weight than facts stated dramatically. You could dismiss drama. Plain fact just sat there. The article named the resident in Portland, Dr. Sarah Odom, surgical attending, who had flagged a chart inconsistency in 2016 and been told she was wrong and had kept her notes anyway. Nora read that paragraph 3 times. "It's going everywhere," Jessamine said, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. "Not just local. The Wire picked it up." Nora put her phone face down on the break room table. "How's the floor?" Jessamine straightened. "Stable. Nothing urgent." "Good." She picked up her coffee. "Let me know if that changes." The afternoon moved. Cases came and went. The hip replacement patient was discharged at 3, and his wife shook Nora's hand at the elevator with both of hers and held on for a moment longer than a handshake required. And Nora let her, because sometimes people needed to hold on for a moment, and there was nothing wrong with that. At 4:30, Pruitt called her desk extension. "Have you seen the statement?" he said. "Which one?" "Hale's attorney. It came out an hour ago." She hadn't. She pulled it up on the break room computer while Pruitt waited. It was 3 paragraphs, formal and controlled, asserting that Dr. Hale maintained his position that the chart entries reflected his good faith clinical judgment, that the broader investigation was politically motivated in connection with a federal matter he had no knowledge of, and that he intended to cooperate fully with the appropriate processes while defending his professional record. It was, she thought, the statement of a man whose attorney had told him to say as little as possible and had written it accordingly. "He's going to fight it," Pruitt said. "His attorney is going to fight it." "Yes." She closed the browser. "Is there something I need to do about the statement?" "No. I just wanted you to know." A pause. "The board is meeting Monday to discuss his privileges formally. It's a public meeting. The agenda is posted." "I know. Ashworth is going to present the telemetry review and the IG findings as part of the record." "I know that too, Derek." A longer pause. "Are you all right?" She thought about how to answer that. She was standing in a hospital break room on a Friday afternoon with cold coffee and 4 days of accumulated sleep debt and the knowledge that a patient had died 8 months ago and that a resident in Portland had been keeping a piece of paper for 8 years, and that the system she'd trusted to get this right was getting it right slowly and imperfectly, and with significant damage along the way. "I'm working," she said. "That's about right for today." Pruitt accepted this. "Okay," he said, and hung up. She finished her shift at 7 and drove home through a city that had, she noticed, taken down the hospital's exterior banner entirely. Not just Hale's photo, the whole banner, replaced with nothing. An empty bracket on the building's facade that would probably stay empty until someone decided what should go there instead. She noticed this without feeling much about it. The banner had always been a strange choice. Most patients didn't need to know their surgeon's name before they were already inside. She ate and slept and woke on Saturday to a text from Carrick. Hale's attorney withdrew the national security motion with prejudice this morning. No refiling permitted. The IG's scope stands. And below that, thought you'd want to know before you started your day. She started her day. The weekend moved differently than the week had. Slower in the institutional sense, the particular pace of a hospital operating on reduced administrative bandwidth, which meant the clinical work was the same, but the bureaucratic noise was quieter. And in that quiet, Nora found something she'd been missing since Monday. The ability to simply be in the job without the job being about her. She was good at this work. She'd known she was good at it, but knowing it abstractly and experiencing it concretely across a Saturday and Sunday of busy, ordinary, demanding nursing care were different things. She knew it concretely now in the way you know things that your hands confirm rather than just your mind. On Sunday evening, sitting in her car in the staff lot before driving home, she called the number for Dr. Sarah Odom. She'd looked it up herself, the way anyone could look up a surgical attending at a Portland hospital. The department directory was public. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment before she dialed, because she wasn't entirely sure what she was going to say. She just knew she needed to say something. It rang 4 times. "This is Dr. Odom. Dr. Odom, my name is Nora Voss. I'm a nurse at Harlow County General in Denton Falls, Wyoming. She paused, decided that the indirect approach was less honest than the direct one. "I'm the provider whose case opened the investigation into Marcus Hale. I read the article on Friday. I read what you did in 2016. I read that you kept your notes." Silence on the other end. Not hostile. Listening. "I wanted to call and tell you," Nora said, "that your notes are part of what's going to close this. The IG's office has them as part of their evidentiary record. Whatever the outcome is, the federal charges, the board investigation, your notes from 8 years ago are in the case." A long pause. "I didn't know if anyone would ever look," Odom said. Her voice was carefully controlled, the voice of a woman who had practiced not showing how she felt about this. "I kept them because I didn't know what else to do with the information. And I moved on because—" She stopped. "You know why. You know what it costs to push back in that environment and lose." "I do," Nora said. "I've thought about that patient for 8 years. I know. Every time I lost a patient after that, even when it had nothing to do with anything except the nature of surgery, I'd think about whether I'd missed something, whether I'd read something wrong, whether my judgment was actually as faulty as Hale said it was." A pause. 8 years of that. Nora sat in her car in the dark parking lot and didn't say anything immediately, because there wasn't a response to that which was adequate. What Odom had just described, 8 years of doubting her own clinical judgment because a powerful person had told her she was wrong when she wasn't, was the kind of damage that didn't show on any chart and didn't get documented in any record and was harder to remediate than a falsified operative note. "Your judgment was sound," Nora said. "It was sound in 2016, and the record shows it was sound. I wanted you to hear that from someone who's seen the documents." Another silence. Longer. "Thank you," Odom said quietly, "for calling. Thank you for keeping the paper." She drove home in the dark and thought about the specific cost of being right in a system that doesn't want to hear it. About the accumulated weight of that, not just on one night, not just in one incident, but across years, compounding, accruing interest. About the residents and nurses and providers who had, over Hale's 11-year pattern, been told their judgment was incorrect and had carried that instruction forward into the rest of their careers, adjusting around a dent that shouldn't have been there. She thought about all the ways that kind of damage was invisible and uncompensated. She thought about what she wanted to do about it. The board meeting was Monday morning, public. Nora went. She wasn't required to attend. She'd given her witness statement to Paulson's office on Thursday, and the statement was in the record, and her physical presence wasn't obligatory. She went anyway because the process that had been running since Tuesday night was arriving at a public milestone, and she wanted to be present for it. Not for drama, not for the satisfaction of seeing Hale's face. For the same reason you stay in the room when something important concludes, because presence is a form of bearing witness, and bearing witness matters. The meeting room at the Wyoming State Medical Board's Denton Falls office was smaller than she'd expected. A standard conference setup, chairs along the walls for observers, a long table for the board's 7 members, and a podium. Maybe 30 people were in the room. Hospital administrators, a few staff members she recognized, 2 journalists, and several people she didn't know whose presence suggested various kinds of professional or personal stake in the outcome. Hale was there, in a suit with his attorney beside him. He looked older than he had on Tuesday night, which was natural because 4 days had passed and those days had been of a particular quality. But there was something beyond that, a compression in his posture, a change in the quality of his presence that had nothing to do with physical aging. The confidence that had moved through trauma one like weather had changed into something more careful, more managed, and the management of it was itself visible. He looked at her once, when she came in. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she found a chair along the wall and sat down. The proceedings were formal and unhurried in the way of regulatory bodies that understand their decisions, have consequences that outlast the meeting, and want to be certain the record reflects that they understood this. Director Paulson presided. Ashworth presented the telemetry review and the IG findings. Corda provided the federal investigation's current status on the record. The Portland resident's documented note from 2016, Dr. Odom's 8 years of kept paper, was entered into evidence and read aloud by the board's administrative recorder in the flat. precise voice of someone reading a legal document, which it now was. Hale's attorney made a statement. He was competent, controlled, and operating within a very narrow channel, arguing procedural objections to the evidentiary scope, raising questions about the admissibility of the federal investigation's findings in a state board proceeding, asserting his client's position that the chart entries reflected genuine clinical judgment. He said nothing that hadn't already been anticipated and addressed, which was visible in the faces of the board members, who listened with the attentiveness of people who had done their preparation and were now confirming that the arguments they'd expected to hear were in fact the arguments being made. It took 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours, the board voted. Medical license suspended, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the federal criminal proceeding and the board's independent investigation into the 2 adverse outcome cases. The suspension was not a revocation. That determination would wait for the completion of the criminal case, but it was public. It was documented. And it was announced in a room with 2 journalists and 30 observers and a recorder whose transcript would be a public record by end of day. Hale stood when the vote was announced. He didn't say anything. His attorney put a hand on his arm and he didn't shake it off, which told Nora something about how much the last week had changed the particular physics of Marcus Hale. 4 days ago, he had stood in a conference room and walked out rather than continue a conversation that wasn't going his way. Today he stood in a regulatory chamber and heard a vote announced and stayed in the room and kept his face controlled, and the control was what told the story. The effort required to maintain it, the visible fact that maintaining it was effort. He left without looking at her. She watched him go. She felt nothing triumphant about it. She thought she might, in the abstract, thought there was some version of this moment that arrived with a cleaner emotional finish. What she actually felt was more complicated and less satisfying than triumph. A recognition that what had just happened was correct and necessary and had come at significant cost to people who hadn't deserved to pay it, and that the accounting for that cost was still ongoing and wouldn't be resolved by a vote in a conference room. She walked out into the midday cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Her phone buzzed. Carrick. Board action recorded. Federal charges filed this morning. Obstruction, records tampering, wire fraud related to billing documentation. Arraignment scheduled for next week. She read this and put the phone in her pocket. Wire fraud, billing documentation. She hadn't known about that dimension, hadn't known that the falsified records had also, in several cases, affected the billing codes submitted to insurance carriers, which had resulted in payments for procedures that were documented differently than they'd been performed. That added a financial crime to the clinical ones, which meant the federal case was considerably more robust than she'd realized, which meant the attorney's strategy of delay and procedural objection had a narrower runway than he'd probably told his client. She walked to her car. She sat in it for a moment without starting the engine, looking at the street, at the ordinary Monday midday traffic of a mid-sized Wyoming city going about its business. She thought about the fact that she'd been suspended from this city's hospital 6 days ago for saving a man's life. She thought about what had moved between then and now. The process, the people, the specific chain of actions and documents and kept papers and time-stamped images that had produced this morning's outcome. She started the engine. She drove to the hospital. Not because she was scheduled, she wasn't, it was her day off, but because Wills was still in 312 and his discharge was being discussed for Wednesday, and she hadn't looked at his most recent labs, and also because there was something she needed to say that she hadn't said yet. The floor was quiet in the midday way. Jessamine was off. The nurse covering the floor was a man named Devereaux, efficient and competent, who glanced at her badge when she came in and went back to his chart without comment. She knocked on 312 and went in. Wills was sitting up at nearly 60 degrees now, which was progress, and he was reading something on a phone. The burner was gone, she noticed, replaced with what appeared to be a regular device, which probably meant the security calculus had changed. He looked up when she came in, and his face did the specific thing it did when she entered a room, that immediate orientation, that updating. Board meeting, he said. License suspended pending criminal resolution. She pulled the chair close. Federal charges filed this morning. He nodded once, taking it in. The wire fraud? You knew about that. Carrick mentioned it last night. He set the phone down. How are you? She looked at him. I'm okay. That's not a real answer. No, she agreed. It's not. She looked at the window, at the October sky outside it. I called the resident in Portland last night, the one who kept her notes. Something moved in his face. She spent 8 years doubting her own judgment, Nora said, because he told her she was wrong. 8 years of second-guessing herself every time she lost a patient, wondering if she was actually as bad as he said. She paused. She's a surgical attending now, probably a good one, but she's carrying that. That's not going to show up in any of the case documents. Wills was quiet. I know, he said. There's no legal remedy for it. No. She looked back at him. How many people like her are there? Across 11 years, 3 hospitals. He held her gaze steadily. The IG team is trying to identify them. Not all of them will be findable. Some of them left medicine. He paused. Some of them changed what they were willing to say out loud, which is the harder damage to trace. She sat with this. It was the part that didn't resolve, the damage that was real and unmeasurable and couldn't be addressed by a board vote or a federal indictment. The accumulated silence of people who had learned, through a specific and personal lesson, that their clinical judgment was contestable in ways that had nothing to do with whether they were right. Ashworth wants to meet with you Wednesday, Wills said. I know. Are you going to go? I said I'd think about it. That was last week. He looked at her with those direct eyes that didn't let you put things aside without at least acknowledging they existed. What do you actually want? She looked at the window. What did she want? She'd been asking herself this in the margins of the last several days without letting herself sit with it fully, because the immediate situation had always provided a reason to defer the question. The immediate situation was no longer providing that reason. She thought about Tuesday night, about walking into a trauma bay and seeing a scar she recognized and making a rapid, correct assessment that no one in the room believed, about stepping back and watching a man she knew was wrong proceed anyway, because the structure of the room said he got to decide and she didn't. She thought about Sarah Odom in 2016 with her flag chart and her notes, being told she was incorrect. She thought about the 11 cases and the 11 years and the way a system could sustain a pattern like that if the people inside it learned that the cost of objecting exceeded the cost of silence. I want to change the ratio, she said. Wills looked at her. Of people who say something versus people who don't. I want it to go the other way. She looked at her hands. Ashworth's offer, senior clinical position, whatever she has in mind, if it comes with actual structural authority, not ceremonial, not a title without power to change how this department functions. She looked at him. Then I'll take it. He was quiet for a moment. That's a real answer, he said. You asked for one. He almost smiled. The almost smile he did, that incomplete thing that she had come to understand was actually the full version, that this was simply how far he let things travel across his face, and that it meant more than a complete smile from someone less careful. When do I get out of here? He said. Wednesday, if your drain output keeps dropping. She stood. Don't rush it. I've been in this room for 6 days. You've been in this room recovering from 2 separate abdominal procedures. That's different from just being in a room. She picked up her jacket. The food is terrible, but the monitoring is good. Use the monitoring. Voss? She stopped. What you did, he said, on Tuesday night and Thursday morning, and whatever you did in between that I don't have full visibility on. He looked at her with those steady eyes. I want you to know that I understand the cost of it, not the professional cost, the other kind, the kind that doesn't get documented. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 4 days of interrupted sleep, about the granola bar she hadn't tasted in a break room at 3 a.m., about standing in a parking lot in the cold and reading a text message about wire fraud, about calling a stranger in Portland and hearing 8 years of kept doubt in the silence before the woman spoke. Go to sleep, she said. She left the room. She was in the elevator when she let herself feel it, just for the length of 1 floor, just for the 30 seconds it took the elevator to descend. She let the accumulated weight of the last 6 days have the space it had been requesting. Not dramatically. Not in the way of things that collapse when you stop holding them. More like the particular release of a muscle you've been holding contracted for a long time. That involuntary ease when the effort is no longer necessary. The elevator opened. She walked out into the lobby and stopped. There was a woman at the admissions desk, maybe 30, with a child on her hip and a look in her eyes that Nora recognized. The specific look of a person who is in a medical building because something is wrong and who does not yet know if the wrongness is manageable or catastrophic. The child was maybe 2, had a slight fever flush, was leaning against the woman's shoulder with the boneless trust of very small people who outsource the management of their fear to the adults holding them. The woman was at the wrong desk. Admissions couldn't help with a sick child at this speed. She needed to be at the urgent care window on the other side of the lobby. Nora walked over. "The urgent care registration is that window," she said, pointing. "They'll get you in faster. Is she breathing okay?" The woman looked at her. The child looked at her with large, glassy eyes. "She has a fever. It came up fast." "Urgent care window. Tell them it came up fast and she's 2. They'll move quickly." She paused. "You're in the right building. She's going to be fine." The woman looked at her, really looked at her, with the gratitude that is so total it barely looks like gratitude, that looks instead like simple relief, the specific relief of someone who has been managing alone and has just briefly not had to. "Thank you," she said, and moved toward the urgent care window. Nora watched her go. Then she walked out through the automatic doors into the cold afternoon. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands in her jacket pockets and her badge on her shirt, and the October sky doing what October skies in Wyoming did, going a hard, specific blue that had no warmth in it, but had a clarity that made up for the absence. The kind of sky that didn't comfort you, but didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. She'd been in this building 6 days ago at midnight with her hands inside a stranger's abdomen and a blood pressure reading that said she had minutes. She'd been suspended from this building 5 days ago for doing something correct. She'd walked back through these same automatic doors, which still stuck slightly in the cold, with her badge returned and a federal investigation running, and a board vote concluded and a surgeon's license suspended, and a resident in Portland whose 8 years of doubt had finally been told they were founded, not faulty. None of it was clean. None of it had landed the way it would in a story told by someone who wanted the ending to feel simple. The 11 years were still 11 years. The patient who died 8 months ago was still dead. Sarah Odom's 8 years of second-guessing herself were 8 years that she would carry in the specific, private way that experience gets carried, regardless of what any investigation concluded. But Hale would not operate again, not pending this investigation, and likely not after it. The pattern was documented, and the documentation was now permanent and public, and would follow the attempts to reconstruct his professional identity the way truth follows falsification when someone finally decides to look. And the imaging timestamp from Tuesday night at 11:52 p.m. was still in the hospital's system. Irrefutable. Unedited. She had been right, and she had stayed right, and she had kept being right, even when the structure around her said that her rightness didn't matter, and eventually, not immediately, not without cost, not without the specific damage that always accompanies the gap between when you are right and when you are believed, eventually the record had caught up with the truth. That was not a comfortable lesson. It was a real one. The thing nobody tells you about quiet strength is that it isn't quiet because it's passive. It's quiet because it doesn't need an audience to know what it is. The person who holds the correct position under pressure, who protects the patient when the room wants to protect the physician's ego, who puts their badge on the nurse's station counter without argument and trusts the timestamp to do the work. That person isn't waiting for vindication to be certain they were right. They're certain before the vindication arrives. The vindication is for everyone else. Nora Voss was 36 years old and she had a medical degree. She'd mostly stopped using, and a military record she hadn't mentioned in job interviews, and a nursing badge that was a little scuffed at the corner from being set on a counter under difficult circumstances. And she was standing on a sidewalk outside a hospital in Denton Falls, Wyoming, on a Monday afternoon, watching a woman with a feverish 2-year-old disappear through an urgent care window. She didn't need a senior clinical role to know what she was. She didn't need the board vote, or the federal charges, or Carrick's briefings, or Okafor in dress uniform in a beige conference room. She'd known what she was when she pressed an ultrasound probe to a stranger's abdomen at midnight and read a screen and made a decision that was correct and said so out loud to someone who didn't want to hear it. But she was going to take the meeting with Ashworth, because the ratio needed to change, and you didn't change ratios from outside the building. She was going to take the meeting, and she was going to tell Ashworth that she needed actual structural authority, the ability to revise how clinical disagreements were documented, how junior staff objections were recorded, how the space between a department chief's version of events and the monitoring record's version of events got handled at this institution going forward. Not a title, a mechanism. And if Ashworth said yes, genuinely yes, with the institutional backing to make it mean something, then Nora was going to do that work. Not because it was dramatic, or because it would put her name on anything, or because it was the natural conclusion of a week that had started with her badge on a nurse's station counter, but because somewhere in Wyoming and Oregon and across 3 hospitals in 11 years, there were providers who had learned to be quieter than their judgment, and she knew what it felt like to be one of them, and she was done with the ratio. She turned and went back inside. The automatic doors stuck slightly in the cold, as they always did. She pushed through them. The floor was waiting.